Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. It began with a phone call that never reached its destination. At 7:42 in the morning, on a quiet stretch of road just outside the town of Alderwick, a call was placed from a mobile phone registered to a man named Daniel Hargreaves. The call lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the connection to open, not long enough for a word to be spoken. The line went dead before it could ring. The call log would later show no signs of interference. No network issues. No dropped signal. Just a clean connection that ended as abruptly as it began. The strange part wasn't the call itself. It was where the phone was found. 2 days later, lying in the middle of a narrow footpath that cut through a line of old birch trees, about a mile from Daniel's home, the phone rested face up on the damp earth. Not hidden, not damaged, simply placed, as though someone had set it down carefully and walked away. There were no footprints around it. The soil was soft from recent rain, but undisturbed. The path itself was rarely used, known mostly to locals who preferred quiet morning walks or solitary evenings away from the town's narrow streets. And Daniel Hargreaves was not the kind of man who went for walks. Alderwick was the kind of place where mornings arrived gently. The town sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by low hills that held the fog a little longer than expected. By the time sunlight reached the narrow rows of houses, it had already softened, diffused through mist and branches and the faint smoke from chimneys. The air often carried a mixture of scents: wet soil, distant wood smoke, and something faintly metallic from the old railway line that hadn't been in use for over a decade. It was a quiet place, predictable, the kind of place where people notice small changes, which is why Daniel's absence didn't go unnoticed for long. He worked at a small hardware store near the center of town, opened at 9, closed at 5, same routine every day. He lived alone in a modest house on the edge of Alderwick, not far from the line of birch trees where the phone would later be found. When he didn't show up for work on Tuesday morning, it was unusual. When he didn't answer his phone, it was concerning. By Wednesday afternoon, it was something else entirely. Detective Inspector Mara Ellison arrived in Alderwick just after noon on Thursday. She had a quiet way of moving, the kind that made people lower their voices without realizing why. Her coat still carried the faint smell of rain from the city, and her notebook was already filled with small, precise handwriting by the time she stepped into the hardware store. The owner, a man named Gerald Pike, stood behind the counter with his hands resting flat on the worn wood surface. "He's never missed a day," Gerald said, not looking directly at her. "Not once in the 5 years he's worked here." Mara nodded, glancing around the store. Everything was in order. Shelves neatly arranged, tools aligned with a kind of quiet discipline. "Did he seem different recently?" she asked. Gerald hesitated. "Not different," he said slowly. "Just quieter." But he was always quiet. Anything out of the ordinary. Gerald exhaled through his nose, thinking. "He stayed late on Monday. Said he needed to finish inventory. That's not unusual either, but..." He paused again. He kept checking his phone, more than usual. Mara made a note. "Did he receive any calls?" "I didn't hear any," Gerald said. "But he stepped outside once. Just for a minute or two." "Did he say who it was?" "No." Mara closed her notebook. "Thank you," she said. Daniel's house sat at the end of a narrow road lined with low stone walls and overgrown hedges. The garden was modest but well kept, though the grass had begun to grow unevenly in the days since his disappearance. Inside, the air felt still. Not stale exactly, just undisturbed. The kitchen was clean. A mug sat by the sink, faint traces of dried tea along the inside rim. A loaf of bread rested on the counter, partially sliced. Nothing suggested urgency or interruption. In the living room, a chair was positioned near the window, angled slightly toward the road. A small table beside it held a book, opened face down, as though it had been set aside with the intention of returning to it shortly. Mara moved slowly through the house, noting details without disturbing them. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made. Clothes hung in the wardrobe in a careful, orderly arrangement. A pair of shoes rested by the door, aligned side by side. Nothing appeared missing. Nothing appeared out of place, except for the absence of Daniel himself. The path where the phone was found lay just beyond the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the trees began to gather more closely together. The birch trees stood tall and pale, their white bark catching what little light filtered through the canopy. The ground beneath them was soft with fallen leaves, even this early in the season, and the air carried a faint, earthy dampness. Mara walked the path slowly, her shoes pressing gently into the soil. "This is where it was," said Officer Liam Hart, gesturing to a spot near the center of the trail. Mara crouched slightly, studying the ground. "Who found it?" she asked. "A local woman. Walks her dog here every morning." "And she didn't notice anything unusual?" Liam shook his head. "She said it was just there, like it had always been." Mara's gaze shifted along the path, following its quiet curve deeper into the trees. "Any signs of a struggle?" she asked. "None," Liam said. "No disturbances. No broken branches. Nothing." Mara stood again, brushing a small bit of soil from her coat. "Phones don't place themselves," she said quietly. Liam nodded, though there was no clear agreement in the gesture. The call log on Daniel's phone showed only one unusual entry. The 3-second call. The number it had been dialed to belonged to a woman named Clara Vance. She lived on the opposite side of Alderwick, in a narrow house near the old railway line. Clara answered the door after a moment, her expression calm but guarded. "Yes," she said. Mara introduced herself, showing her badge. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about Daniel Hargreaves," she said. Clara's eyes flickered briefly, not quite surprise. "Something quieter." "I heard," she said, "about him being missing." Mara nodded. "Your number was the last one dialed from his phone." Clara looked past Mara for a moment, as though considering something just out of view. "I didn't receive a call," she said. "No missed calls either." "It lasted only 3 seconds," Mara said. "It may not have had time to register." Clara crossed her arms lightly, not defensive, but contained. "I haven't spoken to Daniel in years," she said. "Years?" Mara asked. "We used to know each other," Clara said. "A long time ago." "How long?" Clara hesitated. "About 10 years." Mara studied her for a moment. "And you haven't been in contact since?" "No," Clara said. "Not until now, I suppose." Mara nodded slowly. "Would you mind if I asked what kind of relationship you had?" Clara's gaze shifted again, this time toward the faint outline of the railway line visible through the window. "We were close," she said. "For a while." The railway line ran along the edge of Alderwick, cutting through a stretch of land that had long since been reclaimed by nature. Rusted tracks lay half-buried beneath grass and moss, and the wooden sleepers had begun to splinter with age. Few people came here anymore. It wasn't dangerous, just forgotten. Mara walked along the edge of the tracks in the late afternoon, the light beginning to soften as it slipped behind the hills. There was a stillness here that felt different from the rest of the town, less like quiet and more like something held in place. She paused near a section where the tracks curved slightly, disappearing behind a cluster of overgrown shrubs. Something caught her eye. A small indentation in the ground beside the tracks. Not fresh, but not old enough to have fully settled. She crouched, brushing aside a thin layer of leaves. The soil beneath was slightly darker. Disturbed. "Liam," she called softly. He approached, his steps careful. "What is it?" Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small tool, gently pressing it into the soil. It gave way more easily than expected. She looked up at Liam. "Get a team out here," she said. The excavation took the better part of the next day. The soil was soft, layered with years of decay and growth, but beneath it, something had been recently altered. They worked slowly, carefully, each movement deliberate. And then, just before noon, one of the officers stopped. "There's something here," he said. Mara stepped closer, her attention narrowing. A shape began to emerge from the earth. Not large, not immediately identifiable, wrapped in a thin, worn fabric that had darkened with time. They uncovered it piece by piece, until finally it lay fully revealed. A small wooden box. No markings, no lock, just a simple lid, slightly warped from moisture. Mara knelt beside it, her hands still. "Careful," she said. The lid was lifted slowly. Inside, there were only a few items. A photograph, a folded piece of paper, and a key. Mara picked up the photograph first. It showed two people standing side by side, the background blurred but recognizable as the edge of the railway line. Daniel Hargreaves and Clara Vance, younger, smiling. She set the photograph aside and unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, familiar. It read, "If anything happens, it's here." Mara's gaze lingered on the words. Then she looked at the key. Small, brass, slightly worn. Not new, not recently placed, but not old enough to belong to the abandoned railway. "Clara," Mara said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. That evening, the fog settled over Alderwick more heavily than usual. It crept along the streets, softened the edges of houses, and muted the distant sounds of the town. Mara stood outside Clara's house once more, the small wooden box now secured in evidence. She knocked. Clara opened the door almost immediately, as though she had been waiting. Mara held up the photograph. Clara's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. "You found it," she said softly. Mara nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think you should tell me why it was there." Clara stepped aside, allowing her in. The house felt warmer than before, not in temperature, but in something less tangible. They sat across from each other in the small living room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clara exhaled quietly. "We thought it would stay buried," she said. Mara didn't interrupt. 10 years ago, Clara continued, something happened. Out by the tracks. Her voice remained steady, but there was a weight beneath it. "We didn't mean for it to happen," she said. "It just did." Mara's gaze remained fixed on her. "What happened?" she asked gently. Clara looked down at her hands. "There was someone else," she said. "A man. We argued. It got out of control." Her fingers tightened slightly. And then it was over. The room felt quieter. "We didn't know what to do," Clara said. "So we buried it. Out there by the tracks." Mara's eyes flickered briefly. "And the box?" she asked. Clara gave a faint, almost distant smile. "Daniel made it," she said. "Said if anything ever came back, we'd know where to look." "And why did he go back there?" Mara asked. Clara's expression shifted, something like realization settling in. "I think," she said slowly, "he thought it already had." The investigation would continue for weeks. The site by the railway would reveal more. Not everything, but enough. and Daniel Hargreaves would not be found, not in the way they expected, but in the quiet spaces he left behind, in the carefully placed phone, the silent call, the path through the birch trees. There was a pattern, a method, something deliberate, as though, in the end, he had chosen not to disappear all at once, but to leave piece by piece, until all that remained was a question, and the soft, steady quiet of Alderwick, holding its answers just beneath the surface. The quiet of Alderwick did not change in the days that followed. If anything, it seemed to settle more deeply into itself, as though the town had absorbed the disturbance and smoothed it over. Shop doors opened at their usual hours. The same faint chime rang as customers stepped inside. The same slow drift of fog lingered in the mornings, curling around fences and slipping between narrow streets. But beneath that stillness, the investigation continued. Mara began with the smallest detail. The key. It had no markings beyond a faint line worn into the metal where fingers had gripped it over time. The teeth were narrow, uneven in a way that suggested age rather than damage. Not a modern cut, not something recently made. She turned it over in her hand, standing once again in Daniel's house. There were few locks to test. The doors, the windows, the small cupboard beneath the stairs. None of them matched. The key slid in once or twice, but never fully. Never enough to turn, which meant it belonged somewhere else. Somewhere Daniel had expected someone to look. The old railway station sat at the far end of the unused line, nearly swallowed by years of neglect. The platform was cracked and uneven, small weeds pushing up through the gaps. The roof sagged slightly at one corner, its wooden beams darkened by time and damp. Mara arrived just after sunrise, when the light was thin and pale. The air carried a faint scent of rust and wet wood. Somewhere nearby, water dripped in slow, irregular intervals, echoing softly against the hollow structure. Liam followed a few steps behind, his hands tucked into his coat. "Place hasn't been used in years," he said quietly. "They closed it down before the line was abandoned completely." Mara nodded, her attention already moving across the building. The main doors were partially open, one hanging slightly off its hinge. Inside, the waiting area remained mostly intact, benches lined along the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by years of use. A faded timetable still clung to a notice board, its ink barely legible. She moved slowly, her footsteps soft against the dusty floor. "People come here?" she asked. "Occasionally," Liam said. "Teenagers mostly, or the odd person looking for somewhere quiet." Mara paused near the far wall. There was a door there, smaller than the others, set slightly apart. She reached for the handle and tried it. Locked. The key rested cool in her palm. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she slid it into the lock. It fit. Not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough. There was a faint resistance as she turned it, followed by a soft, internal shift. The door opened with a low creak. The room beyond was narrow and dim. A single window, clouded with dirt, allowed in just enough light to soften the edges of what lay inside. The air was cooler here, holding a faint smell of paper and something older, something dry, like wood long untouched. There was a desk against the wall, a chair slightly angled, and a shelf, half collapsed under the weight of what remained upon it. Mara stepped inside, her gaze adjusting. Dust lay thick across every surface, undisturbed except for one area. The desk. She approached it slowly. There, in the center, was a small stack of papers, neatly aligned, not scattered, not abandoned, placed. Mara picked up the top sheet. It was a map, not of Alderwick itself, but of the surrounding land. The hills, the river, the scattered paths that connected one quiet place to another. Several locations had been marked, not with circles or crosses, just small, careful lines, subtle enough that they might have gone unnoticed at a glance, but deliberate. "Liam," she said softly. He stepped closer, looking over her shoulder. "What am I seeing?" he asked. "Not where he went," Mara said. "Where he wanted us to go." The first location lay beyond the northern edge of town, where the trees thickened into something closer to woodland. The trail was narrow, almost hidden beneath low branches and uneven ground. It wasn't part of any official path, but it had been walked often enough to leave a faint suggestion of direction. The air here was quieter, not silent, but softened. The usual sounds of Alderwick, distant voices, the hum of passing cars, didn't reach this far. Instead, there was only the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint, steady presence of wind moving through the higher branches. Mara followed the trail slowly. Each step felt measured, not out of caution, but out of attention. After some time, the trees began to thin, and the ground shifted. The soil gave way to a stretch of flat, pale stone, smoothed over time by water that no longer flowed there. The remains of an old riverbed, long since dried. At the far end of it, partially concealed by a cluster of low shrubs, stood a small structure. A chapel, or what remained of one. The building was modest. Stone walls, weathered and uneven. A roof that had partially collapsed on one side, allowing a thin shaft of light to reach the interior. The wooden door hung open, its hinges rusted but intact. Mara paused at the threshold. There was a stillness here that felt different from the rest of Alderwick. Not empty, but held. She stepped inside. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp stone and old wood. The floor was uneven beneath her feet, scattered with small fragments of debris that had fallen from the ceiling over time. Rows of simple benches faced the front, their surfaces worn and slightly warped. And at the far end, where an altar might once have stood, there was something else. A box. Not buried, not hidden, placed. Mara approached it slowly. It was smaller than the one found by the railway, but similar in design. Simple, wooden, unmarked. She knelt beside it. The lid lifted easily. Inside, there were only two things. A piece of fabric and a cassette tape. Mara held the tape up, turning it slightly in the dim light. No label, no markings, just the faint signs of use along its edges. Daniel didn't leave randomly, Liam said quietly from behind her. Mara shook her head. "No," she said. "He's leading something." She set the tape back in the box, her gaze lingering on it for a moment longer than necessary, or remembering it. They didn't play the tape immediately. Instead, Mara returned to the map. There were more markings, each one leading further from the center of Alderwick, further into places people rarely went. The next lay near the river. The river moved slowly this time of year. Its surface was smooth, reflecting the muted sky above in soft shades of gray and pale blue. The banks were lined with reeds that whispered quietly as the wind passed through them. There was a path that followed the curve of the water, though it was less defined here, fading in and out of visibility as it wound along the edge. Mara walked it in the late afternoon, the light beginning to lower. The air smelled faintly of silt and wet grass. A short distance ahead, something broke the natural line of the riverbank. A structure, wooden, low to the ground. As she approached, it became clearer. A cabin. It stood slightly elevated on a set of worn supports, its wood darkened by years of exposure. The windows were intact but clouded, obscuring the interior. A narrow set of steps led up to the door, which was closed. Mara placed her hand against it. The wood felt cool. She pushed gently. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the space was simple. A single room. A table near the window. A chair pulled slightly away from it. And on the table, another object. A small glass jar. Empty. Or nearly. Mara stepped closer. Inside the jar, settled at the bottom, was a thin layer of fine, pale dust. She opened it carefully. The scent was faint, not unpleasant, just old, like paper or ash. Liam moved beside her, glancing around the room. "There's more of these places," he said. "On the map." Mara nodded. "Yes." She closed the jar and set it back where it had been. Her gaze moved to the window. Beyond it, the river continued its slow, steady path, disappearing into the distance without interruption. "He's not hiding," she said quietly. Liam looked at her. "What do you mean?" Mara's expression remained calm, thoughtful. "He's showing us something," she said, "but not all at once." She stepped back from the table, just enough to keep us moving. That night, the tape was finally played. Not in the station, not in the cabin, but in the quiet of a small room at the edge of town, where the sound could exist without interruption. The tape clicked softly as it began. For a moment, there was nothing, just the faint, underlying hum of the recording itself. Then, a sound, not a voice, something softer, water, moving slowly. And then, after several seconds, a single, distant noise. A train, far away, fading in, and then out again. The tape ended there. No explanation, no words, just the quiet layering of sound. Mara sat still for a long time after it finished, listening to the absence it left behind. Then she reached for the map once more. There were still places they hadn't been, and something told her those places would be quieter still. Morning arrived slowly, as it always did in Alderwick, but Mara was already awake before the light had fully settled across the valley. The map lay open in front of her, its edges slightly curled from handling. The marked locations no longer felt like separate points. They formed something quieter, more deliberate. Not a path exactly, but a rhythm, a way of moving through the town and beyond it. Her finger traced the next marking, further south this time, near the edge of the industrial district that had long since emptied. The warehouses stood in a loose row along a cracked service road, their wide metal doors closed or hanging partially open, depending on how time had treated them. Faded lettering clung to their sides, names of companies that no longer existed, half peeled away by weather and years of neglect. The air here was different, drier. It carried the faint scent of dust and old oil, layered with something metallic that lingered at the back of the throat. Mara stepped inside the nearest open structure. The space stretched wide and hollow, its ceiling high enough that the beams disappeared into shadow. Light entered through broken panels above, falling in thin, pale strips that illuminated patches of the concrete floor. Her footsteps echoed, soft but persistent. Liam followed, his gaze moving across the empty interior. "Nothing's been used here in years," he said. Mara didn't respond immediately. She was watching the floor. There were marks. Not footprints exactly, but faint disturbances. Subtle changes in the thin layer of dust that covered the surface. Lines where something had been dragged lightly. A pattern that repeated, then faded, then appeared again closer to the far wall. She moved toward it. The wall itself was plain, except for a narrow door set low into the structure, almost hidden by a stack of old wooden pallets that had been pushed aside just enough to reveal it. Mara reached for the handle. It resisted slightly before giving way. The room beyond was smaller than expected, and quieter. The sound of the warehouse fell away almost completely, replaced by a kind of contained stillness. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint scent of fabric and something faintly sweet, like aged paper. There was a table in the center, and on it, a tape recorder, not new, not old enough to be forgotten. Placed carefully, its edges aligned with the grain of the wood beneath it. Mara approached slowly. The device was already loaded. A cassette sat inside. Her fingers hovered over the buttons for a moment. Then she pressed play. This time, the sound came immediately. A door, opening, not loudly, just a soft shift of wood against frame. Then footsteps, slow, measured, the same kind of pace Mara had found herself adopting without thinking. There was a pause, and then a voice, not clear enough to distinguish words, just the shape of speech, low, distant, as though recorded from another room. Mara leaned slightly closer. The voice stopped. The tape continued for a few seconds more, carrying only the faint hum of the recorder. Then it ended. Liam exhaled quietly. "That's the first time," he said. "A voice." Mara nodded. "But not meant to be heard," she said. She removed the cassette carefully, turning it in her hand. There was a small marking on the side. A number. 3. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, clouds moving in from the hills. Mara stood near the entrance of the warehouse, the map open again. They had found one tape before. In the chapel, unmarked. Now another, numbered. She traced the remaining locations. "How many do you think there are?" Liam asked. Mara didn't look up. "Enough," she said. The next location led them back toward the railway line, but further along than before, where the tracks narrowed and eventually gave way to overgrowth. There, hidden between two low embankments, was a smaller station, or what remained of one. It had never been large. Just a single platform, a narrow shelter, and a short stretch of track that ended abruptly a little further on. The shelter leaned slightly to one side, its wooden frame worn but still standing. Mara stepped onto the platform. The ground felt different here, more solid, less disturbed, but not untouched. Near the far end, beneath the shelter's overhang, there was a bench, old, weathered, and beneath it, a shape. Mara crouched, brushing aside a thin layer of dirt. A box. Again, but this one was metal. Small, rectangular. She lifted it carefully and set it on the bench. The lid was secured by a simple latch. Inside, another cassette, this one marked 2, and beside it, a folded piece of paper. Mara opened it slowly. The handwriting was the same, neat, controlled. It read, "You don't need all of it." She looked at the tape, then back at the words. Liam shifted slightly beside her. "What does that mean?" he asked. Mara folded the paper again, her movements precise. "It means he chose what we hear," she said, "and what we don't." They didn't play the second tape right away. Instead, they sat for a while on the edge of the platform. The air had grown cooler, carrying the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet arrived. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, then fell silent. Mara's gaze rested on the tracks. They ended just beyond the station, disappearing into a dense stretch of green where nature had slowly reclaimed what had been left behind. "He brought us back here," Liam said. Mara nodded slightly. "Not just here," she said. "Near it." She thought of the first excavation, the buried box, the photograph, the note, and Clara's voice, steady but weighted. "We thought it would stay buried." Mara stood. "There's one more close to this," she said, glancing at the map, before the others spread out again. The trail that led to it was barely visible. It branched off from the far end of the tracks, slipping into a stretch of land that felt less like forest and more like something in between, overgrown, uneven, quiet in a way that suggested few people passed through it. Branches pressed close on either side. The ground dipped slightly, then rose again, and after a short distance, the trees opened just enough to reveal a structure set back from the path. A small building, stone, low, with a roof that had caved in along one side. Mara approached slowly. The doorway stood open. Inside, the space was dim. The light filtered through the broken roof in soft, uneven patches. The air carried a faint scent of moisture and something older, earth, perhaps, disturbed long ago and never fully settled again. There was no furniture, no clear purpose left behind, just the shape of a room, and in the center, a mark on the floor, not recent, but deliberate. Mara knelt, brushing her hand lightly over the surface. The stone was worn smooth, except for that one area, where something had been moved. Repeatedly, Liam stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked. Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed gently against the stone. It shifted, only slightly, but enough. Together, they moved it aside. Beneath it, a shallow space, and within it, another object. Not a box this time, not a tape, but a piece of cloth wrapped tightly around something solid. Mara lifted it carefully, unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small, worn object, a watch. Its face cracked, its hand still, stopped at a precise moment. She held it up to the light. The glass caught the faint glow, reflecting it softly. "Daniels?" Liam asked. Mara shook her head. "No," she said quietly. She turned the watch over. There was an engraving on the back, faded but still visible. A single initial. Not Daniel, not Clara, someone else. Someone who had been part of this long before the tapes. Mara wrapped the watch again, her movements calm. Then she stood, looking around the small, broken structure. The air felt heavier here. Not oppressive, just layered, as though the past had settled into it and chosen not to leave. "He's not just telling us what happened," she said. Liam looked at her. "Then what?" Mara's gaze moved to the doorway, to the narrow trail beyond it, disappearing back into the quiet of Alderwick's edges. "He's showing us how it stayed hidden," she said, "and how it didn't." They left the small stone structure without speaking much. The air outside felt lighter, though the sky had grown more muted, a thin layer of cloud stretching across it like a veil. The trail back seemed narrower than before, branches brushing lightly against their coats as they passed, leaving behind the faint scent of damp leaves and bark. Mara carried the wrapped watch carefully, not as evidence alone, but as something that had been waiting to be found. Back at the car, she paused before getting in. The map rested on the seat, its markings now familiar in a way that felt almost personal. "There's a gap," she said quietly. Liam leaned slightly closer. "Between these two," she added, tracing a space between marked locations. "Nothing written, nothing indicated." "Maybe it's nothing," Liam said. Mara shook her head. "He hasn't left anything to chance so far." She folded the map slowly. "Let's see what's there anyway." The path that filled that empty space was not marked, not even faintly. It began as a suggestion, an opening between two low hedges at the edge of a quiet road, and then narrowed into something less defined, as though it had been used long ago and slowly forgotten. The ground felt softer here, uneven. Each step pressed into a layer of old leaves that released a faint, earthy scent, deeper than the forest paths they had followed before. The air was still. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. After some time, the path dipped downward, leading into a shallow hollow where the light struggled to reach fully. And there, at the bottom, partially obscured by overgrowth, stood a structure unlike the others. It was made of wood, but not like the cabin by the river. Older, darker. The boards were warped slightly, their surfaces rough and splintered in places. A narrow porch ran along the front, its railing partially collapsed, one side leaning inward. A single window faced the path, clouded, not broken. Mara approached slowly. The ground near the entrance felt firmer, as though it had been walked on more recently than the surrounding area. She noticed it immediately. Not footprints, but absence. Where leaves should have settled, there were small clearings. Subtle, repeated. Someone had stood here, not long ago. She placed her hand against the door. It felt dry, warmer than the air around it. She pushed. The door opened inward with a low, drawn-out sound. The interior was dim, but not completely dark. Light filtered through the window in a soft, muted glow, settling across the room in uneven patches. The air held a faint scent of dust and something else, something metallic, but distant, as though it had lingered and then faded. The room was mostly empty. No furniture, no objects placed with intention like the other locations. Just space. Mara stepped inside, her gaze moving slowly across the floor, the walls, the corners where shadow gathered more heavily. Then she noticed the far wall. There was a line, thin, running horizontally across the wood at about waist height. Not natural, too straight, too deliberate. She approached it, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface. The wood felt slightly different along that line. Less rough, more worn. "Liam," she said softly. He stepped closer. "What is it?" She pressed gently. At first, nothing. Then a shift. The wall moved inward just slightly. A hidden panel. They pushed it open together. Behind it was a narrow space. Not a full room. More like a passage. It extended only a few steps before ending at a small recess in the wood. And within that recess, a tape recorder. Another one. This one older than the others. The surface was scratched, the edges worn in a way that suggested it had been handled often over a long period of time. A cassette was already inside. Mara crouched, her movement steady. There was no marking on this one. No number. She pressed play. The sound that emerged was softer than before, almost difficult to hear at first. A low hum. Then, wind, moving through something narrow. A space like this one. There was a pause, then a faint creak. Wood, shifting. And then, after several seconds, a voice. Clearer this time. Still quiet, but close enough to recognize its shape. "We shouldn't have left it there." The words came slowly, measured, not in panic, not in fear, just a statement, a reflection. Mara felt the stillness of the room settle more deeply around her. The tape continued. Another voice this time, lower, less distinct. It was the only place. Silence followed. Then the first voice again. "We said that before." The tape clicked, ended. Neither of them spoke immediately. The air in the narrow space felt unchanged, but something in it had shifted. Not in volume, not in movement, just in meaning. Mara reached forward and removed the cassette, turning it slightly. Still no marking, no indication of where it fit among the others. She stood, stepping back into the main room. The light had dimmed slightly as clouds thickened overhead, softening the already muted glow. "He came back here," Liam said quietly. Mara nodded. "Yes." She glanced toward the doorway, then back at the hidden panel. And not just once. Outside, the air had grown cooler. A faint breeze had begun to move through the trees, carrying with it the distant scent of rain. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, the map open again. Her gaze moved between the marked locations and the space they had just filled. "This wasn't on the map," Liam said. No, Mara replied, but it belongs to it. She traced the remaining points. Fewer now, more spread out, each one pulling them further away from the center, further from where Daniel had lived his quiet, predictable life. Where next? Liam asked. Mara folded the map carefully. There's one near the water, she said. Not the river. The lake sat beyond the hills, where the land dipped into a wide, shallow basin that held water like a quiet mirror. It wasn't large, but it felt expansive in its stillness. The surface barely moved. Only the faintest ripples disturbed it, spreading slowly outward before fading into calm again. The shoreline was uneven, lined with reeds and patches of soft mud that gave slightly underfoot. Mara arrived just as the light began to shift toward evening. The sky reflected across the water in muted tones, blending with the surface so seamlessly that it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. There, Liam said softly, a structure stood near the far edge. Low, rectangular, partially sunken into the ground. Concrete. It resembled a storage bunker more than a building. The entrance was a narrow opening, framed by thick walls that had darkened over time. Moss clung to the edges, softening the harsh lines. Mara stepped closer. The air near the entrance was cooler, damp. The smell of water and stone lingered faintly. She paused before stepping inside. The sound of the lake faded almost immediately, replaced by a soft, enclosed quiet. The interior was small, bare, except for one thing, a chair, positioned facing the far wall. And on the wall, a series of faint marks, lines, not random, grouped, organized. Mara moved closer. They weren't scratches. They had been made deliberately, counted, a sequence. She traced them lightly with her eyes. Groups of 5, then a space, then more. How many? Liam asked. Mara didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, looking at the room as a whole, at the chair, at the wall, at the way the light from the entrance reached just far enough to touch the marks, but no further. Time, she said quietly. Liam frowned slightly. For what? Mara's gaze lingered on the markings, then shifted toward the empty space beside the chair, where something else had once been, something that was no longer there. He waited here, she said, for something to end. The room remained still. The lake outside moved gently, its quiet presence pressing softly against the walls. And for a moment, it felt as though the space itself was holding its breath, not in anticipation, but in memory. Mara remained in the doorway of the bunker for a while, her hand resting lightly against the cool concrete. The air inside held its quiet weight, unchanged, as though it had settled into that shape long ago and refused to move. The marks on the wall seemed less like something that had been created and more like something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. Eventually, she stepped back outside. The lake greeted her with its soft, open stillness. A faint ripple crossed the surface, catching the dimming light before dissolving again into calm. The reeds along the edge whispered gently, brushing against one another in a slow, irregular rhythm. Liam exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath without realizing it. He counted something, he said. Mara nodded. Yes. She looked back toward the bunker entrance, then down along the shoreline. The map had shown another marking nearby, not far, but not directly connected, as if it belonged to the same thought, but from a different angle. The path along the lake curved gradually, narrowing as it moved away from the open water and into a stretch of land where the ground rose slightly and the vegetation thickened. The air changed subtly. The scent of water faded, replaced by something drier, grass, soil, and the faint, lingering trace of old wood. The light grew softer here, filtered through a loose canopy of branches that stretched unevenly overhead. After a short distance, the path gave way to a clearing, and within it, a structure that had once been larger than it now appeared. Only part of it remained intact. A long, low building with a slanted roof, half collapsed at one end. The walls were made of weathered timber, their surfaces faded to a pale gray. One side had fallen inward completely, exposing the interior to the elements. Mara approached slowly. "What is it?" Liam asked. She studied the shape of it. "The old boathouse," she said. "Or what's left of it." The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly as she stepped closer, the wood fragments and dry earth giving way with a soft crunch. Inside, the space opened into a wide, empty room. The smell of aged timber lingered faintly, mixed with the sharper scent of dampness from where the roof had given way. Water stains marked the floor in uneven patterns, and near the far wall, something rested against the wood. A narrow object, long, wrapped in cloth. Mara moved toward it. The cloth was thinner than the one that had held the watch, worn at the edges, its fibers softened by time. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a piece of wood, smooth, carved, a fragment of something larger. She turned it in her hands. There were markings along its surface. Not letters, not symbols, just shallow grooves. Repeated, evenly spaced. Liam stepped closer. "What is that?" Mara ran her thumb lightly over the grooves. "They're not random," she said. "They match something." She glanced back toward the lake, in the direction of the bunker. The marks on the wall, the way they had been grouped. Counted. This felt similar, but smaller, more portable, as though it had been taken from that place, or meant to replace it. She wrapped the object again, slower this time. "Let's keep going," she said quietly. The next location drew them away from the lake entirely, back toward the far edge of Alderwick, where the land flattened and the remnants of old industry gave way to something quieter and more scattered. The road they followed had long since lost its markings. Grass pushed through cracks in the asphalt, softening the hard edges and breaking the line of it into uneven segments. At the end of it stood a structure that felt more deliberate than abandoned. A small building, brick, still intact. Its windows were dark, but unbroken. A sign hung above the door, faded but readable. Alderwick Storage and Transit. Mara paused before it. "This was used," Liam said. "Once," Mara replied. She stepped closer. The door was closed, but not locked. Inside, the air felt still, but not stale. The scent was faint, dust, paper, and something metallic beneath it. The space was divided into narrow corridors, each lined with small storage units. Most of them stood open, their contents long removed. Some doors hung loosely on their hinges. Others had been taken entirely. Mara moved slowly down one of the corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the concrete floor. Then she noticed it. One door, closed, unlike the others. No dust disturbed around it. No signs of age beyond what the rest of the building carried. She reached for the handle, turned it. The room inside was small, bare, except for a single object placed at its center. A chair, simple, wooden, facing the back wall. Mara stepped inside. The air felt different here. Not heavier, just more contained, as though it had been sealed off from the rest of the building for longer than the others. On the wall in front of the chair, a faint outline, rectangular, lighter than the surrounding surface. Something had been there, recently enough to leave a difference, but long enough for the edges to soften. What was it? Liam asked. Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the wall, Her fingers hovered just above the surface. There were small marks around the edges, tiny indentations, from nails or pins. Something had been fixed here, held in place, displayed. She stepped back, her gaze shifting to the chair, positioned at a precise distance, aligned with the center of the wall. "Someone sat here," Liam said. "Yes," Mara replied, and looked at whatever was there. She turned slowly, her eyes moving across the room. There was nothing else. No boxes, no tapes, no objects left behind. Only absence. Deliberate. Chosen. She stepped back into the corridor. "This one's different," Liam said. Mara nodded. "He took something away," she said, instead of leaving it. Outside, the light had begun to fade more noticeably. The sky had taken on a muted tone, the edges of the clouds soft and indistinct. Mara stood near the entrance, the map open once more. There were fewer markings now, only 2 remaining, both further out, beyond the familiar edges of Alderwick. Liam glanced at them. "These are further than the others." "Yes," Mara said. She folded the map carefully. "He's been leading us outward," she said. "Gradually." "Why?" Liam asked. Mara looked back toward the building behind them, then out along the empty road. "Because whatever this is," she said quietly, "it didn't end in one place." The air shifted slightly as the first hint of evening settled in. A faint breeze moved through the open doorway behind them, stirring the quiet inside just enough to be noticed. Mara turned toward the road. "Let's go," she said, and as they walked, the town of Alderwick seemed to recede behind them. Not suddenly, but in the same slow, deliberate way everything else in the investigation had unfolded, leaving only the path ahead, and whatever had been waiting there all along. The road thinned as they moved further from Alderwick, narrowing into a pale strip of worn gravel that curved gently between low, open fields. The town did not disappear all at once. It receded gradually, its sounds fading first, then its shapes, until only the faintest suggestion of rooftops remained behind them. Ahead, the land felt wider, quieter. The sky stretched without interruption, a soft, dim expanse where the light lingered longer than expected, suspended in that slow moment before evening fully settled. Mara drove without speaking, the folded map resting beside her. Liam watched the horizon, his gaze occasionally shifting to the edges of the road, where tall grass bent slightly under the movement of air. "Feels different out here," he said after a while. Mara nodded. "It is." She slowed the car as the gravel gave way to a narrower track, barely more than 2 lines pressed into the earth, leading toward a distant cluster of trees. "That's where we're going?" Liam asked. "Yes." The track ended before the trees. From there, the ground softened, giving way to uneven soil and patches of low vegetation that brushed lightly against their legs as they walked. The air carried a faint scent of dry grass and something else, something mineral, like stone warmed earlier in the day and now slowly cooling. The trees ahead stood close together, forming a loose barrier between the open land and whatever lay beyond. Mara stepped through them first. The light changed immediately, not darker, but more contained, filtered. The ground beneath the trees was clearer, the undergrowth thinner, as though something had kept it from growing fully. And then, just a few steps further, the structure revealed itself. It was long and low, built from dark stone that had absorbed years of weather without losing its shape. The roof remained intact, though uneven in places, and a narrow set of steps led down to a recessed doorway. The building did not feel abandoned in the same way as the others. It felt closed. Mara approached carefully. The air here was cooler, still, Even the faint wind that had followed them across the fields seemed to stop at the edge of the trees. "What is this place?" Liam asked quietly. Mara studied the entrance. "There used to be a pumping station out here," she said, "long before the newer systems were built." She stepped down toward the door. It was metal, heavy, but slightly ajar. Inside, the air shifted immediately. Cooler still, damp. The faint smell of water lingered, mixed with something metallic that had settled into the walls over time. The space extended deeper than expected, a narrow corridor leading inward with pipes running along the ceiling, some intact, others broken or removed entirely. Their footsteps echoed softly. Each sound carried further than it should have. Mara moved slowly, her attention drawn not just to what was there, but to what wasn't. No debris, no scattered remnants like the other places. Just emptiness. Intentional. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a larger room. Circular. The ceiling rose slightly, forming a shallow dome above. And at the center, a platform. Low. Concrete. On it sat a single object. A lantern. Old. Metal frame. Glass panels clouded slightly, but unbroken. Mara approached it carefully. It wasn't lit, but it didn't feel forgotten. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly against the handle. It shifted slightly, not from instability, from recent movement. Liam stepped closer. "Someone's been here," he said. Mara nodded. "Yes." She lifted the lantern. Beneath it, a small indentation in the platform, perfectly shaped, as though the lantern had been placed there again and again, always in the same position. She turned it slightly in her hands. There was something inside. Not fuel, not a wick, a folded piece of paper. She opened the small latch and retrieved it, unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was familiar. Not all light shows what's there. Mara read it once, then again. Liam watched her. "What does it mean?" Mara looked up, her expression calm but distant. "It means he knew we'd be looking," she said, "and he didn't want us to see everything the same way he did." She folded the paper again and returned it to the lantern, then placed the lantern back onto its mark, exactly as it had been. They left the pumping station without disturbing anything further. Outside, the air felt warmer again, though the light had faded another degree, softening the edges of the fields beyond the trees. Mara paused at the threshold before stepping fully back into the open. She looked down at the ground near the entrance. There, pressed lightly into the soil, was a faint mark. Not a footprint. Not clear enough for that. Just a depression. Recent. She didn't point it out, but she noticed it. The second remaining location lay further still, beyond the fields, beyond the trees, closer to the edge of where the land began to rise again into low, uneven hills. The path to it was less defined than any before. It wasn't a path at all, just a direction. They walked for some time in silence. The only sounds the soft shift of grass and the occasional distant movement of wind across the open land. The sky had taken on a deeper tone now, not dark, but no longer holding the last of the day. Ahead, the ground dipped slightly, and within that dip, a structure, small, wooden, but unlike the others, newer, not abandoned long enough to lose its shape. A cabin. It stood alone, no nearby trees, no surrounding structures, just the quiet openness of the land around it. The wood was still intact, its color deeper, less worn by time. The windows were clear, and inside, light, soft, faint, but present. Liam stopped a few steps behind Mara. "Someone's there," he said. Mara didn't respond immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the cabin. The light didn't flicker, didn't move. It stayed steady, as though it had been left that way. Waiting. She stepped forward. each movement slow, measured. The ground beneath her feet felt firmer here, less disturbed by weather or time. As she reached the door, she paused. Her hand hovered just above the surface. Then, she knocked. Once. Softly. The sound seemed to settle into the wood rather than echo away. They waited. Nothing. No movement inside. No shift in the light. Mara placed her hand on the handle. Turned it. The door opened. Inside, the air was warm. Not from heat. From enclosure. The scent was faint. Wood, dust, and something else beneath it. Something familiar. The room was simple. A table. A chair. And on the table, a tape recorder. Another one. Beside it, a single cassette. Marked 1. Mara stepped inside. The light came from a small lamp placed in the corner, its glow soft and steady, casting long, quiet shadows across the room. She approached the table. Her fingers rested briefly on the tape. Then she pressed play. At first, there was nothing, just the soft hum. Then, footsteps. 2 sets. Walking slowly. Gravel beneath them. The sound was clear, closer than any before. Then a pause. And a voice. Daniel's. Unmistakable now. Calm. Measured. It doesn't stay where you leave it. Silence followed. Then another voice. The same second voice from before. Lower. You said it would. A soft exhale. Not quite a sigh. I thought it would, Daniel said. The tape continued. The sound of something being set down. Would. Perhaps. Then, we can't keep coming back, the second voice said. Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, it was quieter. We already are. The tape clicked. And ended. Mara stood still for a long moment. The room felt unchanged. But something had shifted again. Not outwardly, but in the way the pieces connected. She removed the tape slowly, turning it in her hand. Number 1. The beginning, or what he had chosen to make it. Liam exhaled softly behind her. So this is where it started, he said. Mara shook her head slightly. No, she said. She looked around the cabin. At the table, the chair, the steady light. This is where he decided to show it. She set the tape back down, her gaze drifting toward the window. Outside, the land stretched quietly into the distance, the last of the light fading into a soft, even dusk. And there's still one place left, she said. Her voice was calm, but certain, because whatever waited there, it hadn't been left behind. It had been saved. They did not leave the cabin immediately. The lamp in the corner continued to cast its steady, low light, filling the space with a quiet warmth that felt almost deliberate. Outside, the last traces of day dissolved into a soft, even dusk, the horizon fading into a muted line where land and sky became indistinct. Mara stood near the table, her hand resting lightly against its surface. The tape sat where she had placed it. Still, final in its own way, though nothing about it felt like an ending. Liam shifted near the doorway, his gaze moving between the interior of the cabin and the open land beyond. So where is it? He asked quietly. Mara didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the map once more. It unfolded with a soft, familiar sound. The final marking sat further out than any of the others. Not connected by paths. Not near anything that had been used before. Just placed. She traced it slowly. It's not on the way to anything, Liam said. No, Mara replied. She folded the map again. It's away from everything. They left the cabin behind them, the soft light remaining visible through the window long after they had stepped back into the open land. The air had cooled noticeably. The faint scent of grass and earth deepened as night settled in, carrying with it a quiet stillness that felt less like absence and more like something held in place. They walked without speaking, The ground rose gradually beneath their feet, the terrain shifting into low, uneven hills that softened the horizon into a series of slow, rolling shapes. The path, if there had ever been one, was gone entirely. Only direction remained. Mara moved steadily, her pace unhurried, guided more by the map in her mind than the one in her hand. After some time, the land leveled again, and there, in the distance, a structure. It was smaller than the others, lower to the ground, almost hidden. At first, it looked like a natural formation, stone and shadow blending into the hillside. But as they drew closer, its shape clarified. A narrow entrance, set into the earth itself, framed by stone that had been placed there, not formed. The air near it felt cooler, stiller. Even the faint movement of wind seemed to pass around it rather than through. Mara slowed as she approached. "This wasn't on any records," Liam said quietly. Mara nodded. "It wasn't meant to be." The entrance was open, dark beyond the threshold. She stepped closer, pausing just long enough for her eyes to adjust. Then she stepped inside. The temperature dropped immediately. The air was cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of stone and something older, something that had been enclosed for a long time without disturbance. The space was narrow at first, the walls close, the ceiling low. Their footsteps echoed softly, the sound contained, absorbed, and returned in a quieter form. Further in, the passage widened. The ceiling lifted slightly, allowing a thin shaft of dim light to enter from somewhere unseen above. And then, the space opened. It was not large, but it felt complete. The walls were smooth stone, worn not by time alone, but by contact, hands, perhaps, or objects placed and removed over years. At the center of the room was a shallow depression in the ground, circular, deliberate, and within it, an object. Mara approached slowly. The light above fell directly onto it, soft but precise. A box, wooden, similar to the first one they had found near the railway, but darker, older. The surface bore faint marks, small, shallow lines that crossed and overlapped, not forming patterns so much as accumulating over time. She knelt beside it. Her hands rested on the lid for a moment before she opened it. Inside, there were no tapes, no notes, no keys, just one thing, a bundle of paper, bound together with a thin strip of fabric. Mara lifted it carefully. The pages shifted slightly in her hands, their edges worn, softened by use. She loosened the fabric and opened the bundle. The first page was covered in writing. Daniel's handwriting. Neat. Measured. Familiar. She read silently. Liam waited. The room remained still. After a moment, Mara turned the page. Then another. There were many, each one filled, not with explanations, but with observations. Dates. Times. Locations. Descriptions. Small details. The kind that had filled the spaces of the investigation itself. Mara's gaze moved steadily across the lines. "He wrote everything down," Liam said quietly. Mara nodded. "Yes." She turned another page. Her expression did not change, but her focus deepened. "These aren't just records," she said. "They are repetitions." Liam frowned slightly. "Of what?" Mara paused. Her eyes lingered on a particular line. Then she looked up. "Of the same places," she said. "The same movements." She turned the bundle slightly, allowing Liam to see. The entries shifted, not forward, but back, returning to earlier locations. The railway, the chapel, the bunker, again and again, each time with slight differences. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. "He kept going back," Liam said. "Yes." Mara closed the bundle gently. Her hands rested on it for a moment. As if something hadn't settled, she said. She placed the papers back inside the box, but did not close it immediately. Instead, her gaze moved around the room. The walls, the floor, the faint marks worn into the stone. This place didn't feel like the others. It wasn't a point along the way. It was where the way returned. Over and over. A quiet center. Liam shifted slightly behind her. So what does this mean? He asked. Mara remained still for a moment longer. Then she closed the lid. It means, she said softly, that whatever happened, she stood, her movement slow. It didn't stay in the past. The light above flickered slightly, not enough to change the room, just enough to be noticed. Mara stepped back from the center. Her gaze moved once more across the space. There was something else here. Not visible, not placed, but present. The absence of something that should have been. She turned toward the entrance. Liam followed. Outside, the night had settled fully. The sky stretched dark and quiet above them, scattered faintly with distant stars that seemed dimmer than usual. The air felt still, the land around them unchanged, but something about it felt different, as though the quiet had deepened. Mara stepped away from the entrance, her eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. She looked back once. The structure was almost invisible now, blended into the hillside. Hidden. Do you think he came back here last? Liam asked. Mara considered the question, then shook her head. No, she said. She looked out across the land, toward where Alderwick lay, unseen beyond the hills. I think this is where he realized he couldn't stop coming back. The wind moved faintly through the grass. A soft, passing sound. Mara turned. Let's go, she said. And as they walked, the place behind them seemed to close again, not physically, but in the quiet way it had always existed. Waiting, not for discovery, but for return. They did not return to Alderwick immediately. Instead, Mara adjusted their direction slightly, guiding them along the ridge rather than back down into the valley. The ground beneath their feet felt firmer here, packed by time and weather into a quiet, stable surface that carried their steps without sound. The night had settled fully, but it was not dark in a heavy way. There was a softness to it, a pale wash of light from the sky, just enough to outline the hills and the low dips between them, just enough to keep the world visible without fully revealing it. Liam walked a step behind her, his attention shifting between the ground and the horizon. Where are we going? He asked after a while. Mara didn't stop. There's something we passed, she said. Liam frowned slightly. I didn't see anything. Mara nodded. You weren't meant to. The ridge curved slowly, leading them toward a narrow descent that cut between two uneven rises of land. The path was subtle, barely more than a difference in texture, where the grass grew thinner and the soil showed through in faint, irregular patches. As they moved downward, the air changed again. Cooler, damp. A faint scent began to emerge. Earth, but deeper than before. Heavier. Water, perhaps, but not open like the lake. Contained. At the base of the descent, the land leveled into a shallow basin. And there, almost hidden within it, a narrow channel of water. It wasn't a river. Not anymore. The bed was too shallow, the flow too slow. Water moved through it in a quiet, steady line, slipping over smooth stones that had been worn down over years of passing current. The surface barely reflected the light. Instead, it absorbed it. Dark. Still. Mara stepped closer, her gaze moving along the edge of the channel. There was something different here. Not in the water, but beside it. A narrow strip of ground, slightly raised, running parallel to the flow. And along that strip, marks. Not recent, but not natural. Liam crouched slightly, brushing his hand lightly over the surface. "They're like tracks," he said. Mara nodded. "Repeated movement," she said. She followed them slowly. They led along the channel, then curved away from it, rising slightly toward a cluster of low trees. The trees were thinner here, spaced irregularly, their branches reaching outward more than upward, and between them, a structure. It was smaller than the others, barely more than a frame. Wooden posts, weathered but still upright, supporting a partial roof that sagged inward at the center. The walls were gone, or perhaps they had never been there. Just the outline remained. Mara stepped inside the frame. The ground beneath her feet was different. Not soft, not uneven, pressed flat, as though it had been used repeatedly over a long period of time. At the center, a circle, faint, drawn into the earth, its edges softened by time, but still visible. Mara knelt beside it. Her fingers hovered just above the surface. "It's not recent," Liam said. "No," Mara replied. She traced the edge lightly. "It's been here a while." She looked up. The roof above had a gap at its center, allowing a narrow shaft of pale night light to fall directly into the circle. The alignment felt intentional, not precise, but deliberate. She stood slowly. "He came here too," Liam said. Mara nodded. "Yes." Her gaze moved around the structure. There were no objects, no tapes, no boxes, just the space, the marks, and the feeling of repetition, as though something had been done here more than once, and then stopped. They left the frame behind and followed the faint tracks further. The ground began to rise again, leading them toward another narrow passage between low hills. The air shifted once more. The dampness faded, replaced by something drier, fainter. The scent of old wood returned. Mara slowed. "This wasn't on the map either," Liam said. "No," she replied, "but it's part of it." The passage opened into a small clearing, and within it, a structure that felt both familiar and entirely separate. It was a station, or what remained of one, smaller than the others they had seen, more isolated. The platform was short, barely extending beyond the length of a single carriage. The tracks beside it were still visible, though partially buried beneath dirt and grass. A sign stood at one end. The lettering had faded almost completely. Only a few shapes remained, indistinct and unreadable. Mara stepped onto the platform. The wood creaked softly beneath her weight. The air was still here. No wind, no movement, just the quiet presence of a place that had been left behind without being fully forgotten. At the center of the platform, a bench, different from the others, newer, or at least less worn. Mara approached it slowly. There was something on it, a small object, placed carefully near the center. She reached for it. A matchbox, simple, unmarked. She opened it. Inside, only one match, unused. Liam watched quietly. "That's it?" he asked. Mara nodded. She closed the box again, holding it lightly in her hand. Her gaze moved along the tracks. They extended a short distance before disappearing into the ground, swallowed by time and neglect. "Light," Liam said after a moment. Mara glanced at him. "The lantern," he continued. "The note." Mara nodded slowly. "Not all light shows what's there." She looked back at the matchbox. "And some of it hasn't been used yet." She placed the matchbox back on the bench exactly as she had found it, then stepped back. The platform felt unchanged, but the space held something new now. Not a clue, not an answer, just another piece of the same quiet pattern. She turned slightly, her gaze moving beyond the station. There was something else, further out, a shape, barely visible in the dim light. Liam followed her line of sight. "What is that?" Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, She stepped off the platform, moving toward it. The ground shifted underfoot, uneven but stable enough to walk without hesitation. As they drew closer, the shape clarified. Low, rectangular, partially embedded in the earth. Another structure. But this one felt different. Not abandoned, not placed, but used. Recently, Mara slowed. The air around it felt subtly disturbed. Not in movement, in presence. She reached the edge of it, paused, then looked down. The entrance was narrow, but open, and from within, a faint sound, so quiet it almost blended with the stillness, but distinct enough to notice. Liam stepped closer. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly. Mara nodded. "Yes." She knelt slightly, leaning closer to the opening. The sound became clearer. Not voices, not movement. Something simpler. Steady, rhythmic, like breathing. She remained there for a moment, listening, not reacting, just allowing the sound to exist. Then, slowly she stood, her expression unchanged, but her focus sharpened. "He didn't leave everything behind," she said quietly. Liam looked at her. "What do you mean?" Mara's gaze remained on the dark opening. "It means," she said, "something stayed." Mara did not enter the structure immediately. She remained still, listening. The sound continued, soft, steady, almost blending with the silence around it. Not mechanical, not quite human either. Just a quiet rhythm, consistent enough to feel intentional. The air at the entrance was cooler, carrying a faint scent of earth and something else beneath it. Familiar now, present in more than one place they had visited. Liam shifted slightly behind her. "Could be water," he said quietly. Mara nodded. "Could be." But she didn't move yet. Instead, she stepped back and looked around the area. The ground here was different from the others. More disturbed. Not recently, but repeatedly. Small depressions. Subtle paths formed by movement over time, not all at once. Her gaze followed them outward, back toward the station, toward the narrow channel of water, toward the frame in the basin. And further still, the pattern began to settle, not as a line, but as a loop. They entered together. The passage sloped downward slightly, the ceiling low enough that Liam had to tilt his head as they moved deeper inside. The sound grew clearer, though it remained soft, contained within the space. A few steps further, the passage opened into a small chamber. The source of the sound revealed itself quietly. Water, not flowing in a stream, but dripping from the ceiling, at a steady, patient rhythm. Each drop falling into a shallow pool below, barely disturbing its surface. Mara stepped closer. The pool was small, circular, and beside it, a familiar shape, a chair, positioned at an angle, not directly facing the water, but close enough to observe it without needing to move. The wood was worn, not by age alone, by use. She crouched slightly, her hand brushing the surface of the chair's back. It felt smooth, handled, used often. Liam remained near the entrance. "So this is it?" he asked. Mara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the ground around the chair. There were marks. Faint, repeated, the same kind of disturbance they had seen before. Not frantic, not scattered, just the quiet evidence of someone returning. Again and again, she stood slowly. Her gaze moved to the water, the steady drip, the unchanged rhythm. "He came here," she said softly. Liam nodded. "Yeah." "Not once," Mara continued. "Not to leave something." She glanced around the small chamber. No boxes, no tapes, no notes, nothing placed, nothing staged, just the space. And not to take anything away. Liam frowned slightly. "Then why?" Mara didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, moving toward the entrance again. The sound of the water softened as they left, returning to something almost indistinguishable from silence. Outside, the night remained still. The land stretched around them, unchanged. But the pattern had settled now, not in pieces, as a whole. They returned to Alderwick the following morning. The town greeted them in the same quiet way it always had. Nothing had shifted on the surface. The same narrow streets, the same muted sounds, the same steady rhythm of ordinary life. But for Mara, the investigation had already moved past the places themselves. It rested now in how they connected. She spread Daniel's papers across the small table in the room she had been using, each page aligned carefully, each entry read again, slower this time, not searching for something new, but allowing what was already there to settle. Liam sat across from her, silent. After a while, he spoke. He kept going back, he said. Mara nodded. Yes. To all of them. Yes. Liam leaned back slightly. But nothing changed, he said. Not really. Mara looked up. That's the point, she said. She turned one of the pages toward him. A series of entries. Dates spread over years. The same locations repeating. The railway, the chapel, the bunker, the station, the cabin, and the final place, the chamber beneath the earth. Each time, the descriptions shifted slightly, not in the places themselves, but in what Daniel noticed, what he focused on, what he wrote. He wasn't tracking what happened, Mara said. He was tracking what stayed. Liam studied the pages. And Clara, he asked. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for the photograph, the one from the box. Daniel and Clara standing near the railway. Younger, unaware of what would follow. They buried something, she said. We know that. Liam nodded. Yeah. Mara placed the photograph down. But that wasn't the only thing that stayed, she continued. Clara's house was quiet when they arrived. The same as before. The same stillness. She opened the door after a moment, her expression unchanged, though there was something behind it now. Not fear. Not resistance. Recognition. You've been to all of them, she said. Mara nodded. Yes. Clara stepped aside, letting them in. The room felt warmer than the others they had visited. More lived in, but quieter in its own way. Mara didn't sit. She remained standing. He didn't stop coming back, she said. Clara didn't respond immediately, but her gaze lowered slightly. No, she said after a moment. He didn't. Liam shifted beside Mara. Why, he asked. Clara exhaled softly. Not tired, just steady. Because it didn't end, she said. They spoke for a long time. Not quickly, not in a way that rushed toward an answer. Clara's voice remained calm, measured, much like Daniel's had been on the tape. It was an accident, she said. We didn't plan it. We didn't even understand it at first. Mara listened. The words aligned with what they had already found. The places, the repetitions. We buried him, Clara continued. Out by the tracks. We thought that was the end of it. Her hands rested lightly in her lap. Still, but it wasn't, she said. Liam leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Clara looked at him, then back at Mara. He kept going back, she said. At first, just to check, to make sure nothing had changed. Mara nodded slowly, and then Clara's gaze drifted slightly, as though following something only she could see. Then he started noticing things, she said. Small things. Mara didn't interrupt. The ground felt different. The air, the way the place sounded. Clara's voice remained quiet. Nothing obvious. Nothing you could point to and say was wrong. She paused, but it didn't feel settled. Mara's gaze softened slightly. She understood now, not in a sudden way, but as something that had been forming quietly through every place they had visited. He thought it was still there, she said. Clara nodded. Yes. Not physically, Mara added. Clara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Something like that. The room remained quiet. Liam leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. So he kept going back, he said. Clara nodded. Yes. To all the places, she said. Not just the burial. Mara's eyes flickered slightly. He created them, she said. Clara looked at her. Yes. The tapes. The objects. The marks. Clara's voice remained steady. He thought if he mapped it out, if he understood it. She didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. Mara spoke quietly. He was trying to make it end. Clara's gaze lowered again. Yes. And it didn't. Clara shook her head slightly. No. There was a long silence. Not uncomfortable. Just still. Then Liam spoke again. So where is he? He asked. Clara looked up. For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Just a quiet acceptance. He stopped coming back, she said. Mara held her gaze. When? Clara thought for a moment. Recently, she said. A few days before he disappeared. Mara nodded slowly. And you haven't seen him since? No. Mara stepped toward the window. Outside, Alderwick moved gently through its day. Nothing out of place. Nothing disturbed. He didn't vanish, she said quietly. Liam looked at her. What? Mara turned slightly. He left the pattern, she said. Clara watched her. Mara continued. Everything he did, all those places, the repetition. She paused. Then it stopped. Liam frowned slightly. You think that means something changed? Mara shook her head. No, she said. I think it means he did. The quiet settled again. Clara's voice, when she spoke, was softer. He said something, she said. Mara looked at her. The last time we spoke, Clara continued. He said it wasn't about what happened anymore. Mara waited. Clara's gaze drifted slightly. He said it was about where it stayed. Mara nodded slowly. That matched everything. The places, the patterns, the stillness, the absence of resolution. He realized it wouldn't go away, she said. Clara met her eyes. Yes. And then he stopped trying to make it. Clara didn't answer, but she didn't need to. They left Clara's house in the late afternoon. The light had softened again, settling gently over the town. Liam walked beside Mara, quiet for a long time before speaking. So that's it, he asked. Mara considered the question, then nodded. Yes. He looked back toward the street behind them. And him. Mara followed his gaze. The town remained as it always had. Unchanged. He's somewhere, she said. Not hiding. Not lost. Liam waited. Mara's voice remained calm. He just stopped returning. That evening, she walked alone, out past the edge of Alderwick, toward the birch trees. The path felt the same beneath her feet. Soft. Undisturbed. The place where the phone had been found remained quiet. Empty. She stood there for a while, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it, the kind that held meaning. Then, slowly, she turned back, leaving the path as it was, unchanged, because some things, she understood now, did not need to be uncovered, only understood, and left where they had settled. Case 2. The first time anyone noticed something was off in Willowbrook, it was the way the fog lingered. Not the kind of fog that rolled in thick and fast from the river and disappeared by midday, but a softer, persistent mist that seemed to settle only around the old Hawthorne house at the edge of town. People would pass it on their morning walks, or when driving home from the market, and notice the faint glimmer of light behind the curtains, long after dusk. It was subtle, easy to dismiss, yet it had an almost tangible stillness, like the house itself was holding its breath. Ellie, a librarian who had lived in Willowbrook her entire life, was the first to mention it aloud. She was organizing a small display of local histories in the library when she mentioned the house to her colleague, Thomas, a retired schoolteacher with a quiet fondness for observation. "I've walked past it dozens of times," she said, flipping through an old photograph of the house. "And sometimes it almost feels like someone is watching the street from inside. But no one ever comes or goes." Thomas tilted his head, squinting at the picture. "The Hawthorns left 30 years ago," he said. "No one's lived there since." Ellie nodded, her eyes tracing the edges of the frame. The house had always been a peculiar presence in Willowbrook, its shutters a faded green, the paint peeling in long strips, the garden overgrown in a way that seemed deliberate, almost protective. Most of the town simply passed it by, as if acknowledging it too closely might awaken something dormant. It was a Thursday when the first small clue appeared. Ellie had been walking home through the quiet streets, the late afternoon sun filtering through the fog, when she noticed a scrap of paper stuck beneath a rock near the front gate. She bent to pick it up. It was a fragment of a page, torn cleanly, with a single line written in careful, looping script. "I remember the sound of the river at night." She turned the paper over, but it was blank. Curiosity tugged at her, though she could not have explained why. She carried it home, placing it on her desk beside a small lamp. That night, when the fog pressed against her windows and the faint scent of wet earth drifted inside, she thought about the Hawthorne house and the strange way the light lingered there. The next day, she mentioned it to Thomas. "I found this near the house," she said, smoothing the paper across the table. I don't know, like it's waiting for someone to notice." Thomas leaned in, adjusting his glasses. "Odd. The Hawthorns had a daughter, Margaret. She disappeared the year they left. No one ever found her, not even a trace." Ellie's fingers lingered over the paper. "Do you think," she began, but stopped. It seemed too far-fetched, and yet the thought refused to let go. Over the next week, small signs continued to appear. A single shoe, weathered and small, resting against the fence. A single chair overturned in the garden, though no one had been seen there. At night, faint knocks on the front door of the library, quiet enough that Ellie often assumed it was the wind, but each time she went outside, nothing was there. She began to make slow, measured visits to the house. The front gate, once heavy and resisting, now opened with a creak that seemed almost welcoming. She would step inside, her footsteps muffled by decades of dust, and let her eyes adjust to the dim light. The furniture was largely gone, but the rooms themselves retained an uncanny sense of habitation, as though someone had only recently left. A faint warmth lingered near the hearth, and in the corners of her vision, shadows seemed to gather without moving. On one visit, Ellie discovered a small, narrow staircase leading to a loft at the back of the house. She climbed it slowly, hand trailing along the worn banister, and found a collection of objects, an assortment of notebooks, jars filled with pressed leaves, and a single photograph of a girl standing by the river, her hair catching the dim sunlight in a way that seemed almost unreal. Beneath the photograph was a note, neatly folded. "I am here, always, if you remember." The words settled into her mind like a slow, persistent echo. Ellie began to visit the house more frequently, her senses attuned to the slightest disturbances. A drawer half open in the kitchen would be pushed back carefully. A chair would be rotated slightly when she returned to a room. Each detail was small, unhurried, but undeniable. One evening, she found herself standing by the river behind the house. The fog rolled in gently from the water, curling around the reeds, and the surface of the river shimmered with reflected light from the moon. She heard the faintest sound of laughter, soft, distant, almost as if the river itself were speaking. She followed it along the bank, her feet silent on the damp earth, until she came upon a small clearing where the grass was worn flat, as though someone had been sitting there for a long time. There, partially hidden beneath the reeds, she discovered another scrap of paper. The words were simple, almost childlike. "I wait for those who listen." It was then that the subtle truth began to reveal itself. Margaret Hawthorne had not left in the way the town believed. She had stayed, quietly, in the shadows of the house and the edges of the river, creating small traces, little invitations for someone to notice, to remember, to acknowledge her presence. There was no malice in it, no frantic attempt to be found, only a quiet persistence, like the fog itself. Ellie began to document her findings, writing down the objects, the scraps of paper, and the subtle changes she noticed each day. Thomas joined her on some visits, his careful eyes catching patterns she might have overlooked, the arrangement of objects in the loft, the timing of the lights in the windows, the direction of the faint noises at night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a map of Margaret's existence emerged. She had created a life within the edges of the town's memory, a presence that was at once invisible and intimately intertwined with the spaces she had once occupied. In the evenings, Ellie would return home and sit by her lamp, tracing the lines of each note, reflecting on the quiet persistence of the girl who had lived in the shadow of Willowbrook all these years. The town continued its slow, ordinary rhythm, the bakery filled with the smell of fresh bread, children playing in the streets, the soft hum of evening cars. But for Ellie, and occasionally for Thomas, there was a new awareness that lingered like a soft fog, that some presences are quiet, patient, and subtle, leaving traces that only those who listen closely can perceive. Weeks passed, and the fog around the Hawthorne house seemed to thin, though it never fully disappeared. Ellie and Thomas continued their slow, unhurried visits, sharing observations and silent moments by the river, finding comfort in the deliberate pacing of discovery. Margaret's traces remained, small and unassuming, like whispers from the past that refused to be ignored. One late afternoon, Ellie found herself leaning against the railing of the loft, looking at the collection of notebooks and jars, and she understood something she had not before. This was not a case to be solved in the traditional sense. There would be no dramatic revelation, no confrontation with the past. Margaret's life, her subtle insistence on being remembered, was already complete. The truth was not a story of disappearance or crime, but of endurance, of presence, of the slow unfolding of memory across decades. The river flowed quietly below, reflecting the soft gold of the setting sun. The house, with its peeling paint and overgrown garden, breathed gently in the evening air. And in the delicate mist that lingered over Willowbrook, Ellie could feel the faint warmth of Margaret's presence, patient and unwavering, a gentle reminder that some mysteries are meant to be lived with, slowly, and to be discovered not in a moment of clarity, but in the quiet, reflective spaces of attention. Ellie closed her notebook, letting the pen rest gently on the page. The town moved on around her, unaware of the subtle traces left behind in its shadows. She returned to the river one last time that evening, listening to the soft murmur of the water, the distant rustle of reeds, the almost imperceptible echoes of a presence that had never truly left. And as the fog curled around the banks, she allowed herself to feel a profound sense of calm, knowing that in Willowbrook, some mysteries exist not to unsettle, but to teach the patience of observation and the quiet persistence of memory. And so, In the slow, lingering hours of the evening, the Hawthorne house remained quiet, watchful, and gently alive, a testament to the subtle, enduring traces left by those who quietly inhabit the spaces around us, waiting only for someone to notice and to listen. In the days that followed, Ellie began exploring parts of Willowbrook she had rarely ventured into. She walked slowly along side streets where the asphalt was cracked and softened with moss, the occasional ripple of water from a hidden gutter giving a gentle murmur beneath her feet. She noticed how the air smelled different here, damp, earthy, with the faint hint of lilacs from a neighbor's garden, and a lingering metallic tang she couldn't place. Her attention was caught by a narrow alley behind the town's old mill, a building long abandoned and wrapped in ivy. The wooden shutters were warped, some hanging crooked, and the windows were dusty and clouded. As she stepped inside, her shoes squeaked softly against the wooden floorboards. The interior was dim, filtered through cracks in the boards. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of afternoon light, and the faint smell of old grain and mildew lingered in the air. Ellie's fingers traced the rough texture of the walls as she moved, feeling for anything that might have been left behind. Near the back, she discovered a small, rusted trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a sagging rug. It was heavy, reluctant to move, but she managed to lift it enough to peer into the shallow space below. It was dark, filled with the soft scent of damp earth and decay, but she thought she could make out the faint outline of objects stacked in careful order: boxes, old books, and a single, worn blanket. She did not reach in immediately. Instead, she closed the trapdoor and made a note to return with a flashlight. Later that evening, she met Thomas at the library, the quiet hum of the heating system filling the space. She laid out her observations: the alley, the mill, the trapdoor. Thomas listened intently, tapping a finger against his chin. "There's a pattern here," he said quietly. "Each place, Hawthorne House, the mill, these are edges of the town, margins where life slows down, where fewer people look." Ellie nodded, tracing a finger along the map she had drawn. "And each time I notice something, it's always small. A scrap of paper, an arrangement of objects, a sound. Nothing obvious, just subtle traces." They decided to return to the mill the next morning. The air was colder then, the fog clinging low to the ground, brushing against their ankles. As they approached, they heard the soft creak of the shutters swaying in the wind and the occasional tap of a loose board above, like the building itself was breathing. Ellie paused at the trapdoor, listening. There was a faint scratch, almost imperceptible, coming from below. She crouched and whispered, "Do you hear that?" Thomas nodded, his expression calm but alert. "Something's there," he said, "but it's not frantic. It's measured." They lifted the trapdoor together, revealing the small space below in more detail. The boxes were labeled in Margaret's careful hand, dates running across the spines in a meticulous order. The blanket was folded neatly, and tucked beneath it was a small notebook, its cover faded and smoothed by time. Ellie opened it slowly. The pages were filled with short, careful entries. Observations of the town, notes about birds, the river, passing travelers, and sometimes fleeting mentions of people who had once visited the Hawthorne house. She read aloud a line. "The fog carries stories tonight. Listen closely, but do not disturb." Thomas leaned closer, whispering. She was chronicling life in the shadows. Every detail mattered, even the ones no one would notice. As they carefully replaced the items, Ellie's eyes caught a small window near the back of the mill. It was cracked open, and a thin beam of morning light fell across the floor, illuminating something she hadn't seen before. A faint set of footprints leading from the trapdoor to the window, then disappearing into the thin layer of dust. The prints were small, deliberate, and oddly precise, as if someone had walked only where they wanted to be seen, or perhaps only where they wanted to leave a trace. They lingered in the mill for a long while, listening to the subtle sounds, the soft whine of wind through broken panes, the distant drip of water, the muted call of a crow somewhere beyond the trees. Nothing happened suddenly. Everything felt deliberate, measured, and patient. In the following days, Ellie began noticing other traces around town. A book placed deliberately on a park bench, its spine worn and pages smudged. A small, carved figure tucked behind the church fence. The faint smell of lilacs and damp earth along a seldom-used path leading to the riverbank. Each discovery was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet together they formed a network of subtle communication, a path that Margaret had left behind for anyone paying attention. Ellie and Thomas met often to discuss these small clues, their conversations hushed and slow, filled with reflective pauses. They speculated on the rhythm of Margaret's movements, the intentionality behind her traces, the way each object or note was placed to guide, or perhaps simply to be noticed. They noticed patterns in the light and shadows, the way sunlight fell across a garden in the afternoon, the way fog wrapped the edges of the town in soft layers of gray, highlighting the places she had chosen. One late afternoon, Ellie wandered down a narrow trail behind the cemetery, a path she had never taken. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, the air heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil. At the end of the trail, partially hidden beneath brambles, was a small wooden bridge spanning a trickle of water. Beneath the bridge, she saw markings on the stones, faint scratches, deliberate but delicate, almost like an alphabet she could not yet decipher. She knelt, running her fingers over the rough surface. A faint echo of the river whispered beneath her, and she realized the sound carried a rhythm, like words spoken softly but deliberately. Ellie returned home that evening, carrying a notebook to record everything. She wrote slowly, carefully, not wanting to disturb the subtle order of the clues. Each entry was small, like a thread in a larger tapestry she could only glimpse. She could feel the presence in the town more acutely now, not haunting or frightening, but patient and deliberate, waiting for her and Thomas to notice the rhythm of it all. At night, she sometimes lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds outside her window, the distant hum of the river, the whisper of leaves brushing against each other, the soft creak of a swing moving in a deserted park. And in that quiet, she felt Margaret's presence again, not as a threat or mystery to solve, but as a gentle, enduring thread woven into the fabric of Willowbrook, reminding her to notice, to reflect, and to follow the traces with patience. Each day, the investigation deepened, not with dramatic revelations, but through observation, careful thought, and an attunement to the subtle language of the town. The rhythm of life and memory, the quiet insistence of small traces, and the soft pulse of presence in empty spaces. All these guided Ellie and Thomas as they moved, step by step, through the slow unfolding of a mystery that refused to be rushed. And in the quiet hours, when the fog rolled low and the town slept, the mill, the Hawthorne house, the river, and the narrow trails seemed to breathe together, waiting, in their own patient way, for the story to be discovered, piece by quiet piece. The following week, Ellie decided to explore the northern edge of Willowbrook, where the town began to thin and the forest reclaimed the old pathways. The map she carried was hand-drawn in part, patched together from memory, notes, and the faint clues Margaret had left behind. The morning was still and cool, with dew clinging to the moss that grew along the edges of the worn trail. Each step released a soft rustle of leaves and the occasional squish of damp earth beneath her shoes. She came upon a small clearing she had never noticed before. A cluster of birch trees formed a natural circle, their white bark streaked with gray, and the soft hum of wind through the leaves sounded almost like whispered conversation. In the center, the ground was unusually bare, the moss flattened as if someone, or something, had been kneeling there for hours. At the edge of the clearing, half buried under fallen leaves, she found a small, carved wooden box. The surface was smooth and worn, polished by time and careful handling. Opening it slowly, she discovered a single folded piece of paper, the ink faded to a soft brown. Follow the light where shadows linger. Ellie held the paper for a long moment, feeling the weight of its simplicity. She could hear the faint trickle of a nearby stream, the hum of insects beginning their morning chorus, and the distant call of a woodpecker tapping on a tree trunk. The world felt paused, the way it sometimes did when one noticed the smallest details. She continued along the forest path, guided by instinct as much as by the cryptic instruction. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in scattered beams, illuminating patches of ferns and the rough bark of ancient oaks. The air smelled of damp pine needles and wildflowers, and occasionally, the scent of rich earth rising from small mounds disturbed by unseen creatures. Half an hour later, she came to an abandoned greenhouse, its glass panes streaked with grime and some cracked, letting in jagged slivers of light that cast fractured patterns on the dirt floor. Inside, the air was warmer, moist and heavy with the smell of decaying plants. The shelves were warped, some collapsed. Yet in a corner she found small seedlings growing in neat rows, carefully tended despite the neglect around them. A faint rustle drew her attention, and she noticed a notebook tucked beneath a broken bench. Its pages held sketches of plants, maps of the town, and tiny notes written in Margaret's familiar looping script. Life persists quietly, even where others forget. Thomas arrived the next afternoon, his shoes crunching softly on the gravel path as he approached. They moved together through the greenhouse, talking in whispers. Thomas's eyes lingered on details Ellie might have overlooked: the angle of a sunlight beam, the pattern of moisture on the glass, the slight tilt of the seedlings as if leaning towards something unseen. Outside the greenhouse, they followed a narrow trail that led to a hidden stone bridge arching over a shallow creek. The stones were cold and slick with moss, the water beneath murmuring in gentle ripples over smooth rocks. On one of the bridge supports, faint carvings caught Ellie's eye: initials, dates, and small symbols she did not recognize. The markings were not chaotic but deliberate, like a quiet ledger of someone's presence over time. A soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the smell of wet earth and the faint scent of flowers from the far bank. Ellie knelt to trace one of the carvings with her fingertip, feeling the shallow grooves and imagining the hand that had pressed them into stone. Thomas crouched beside her, pointing out patterns she had missed, the repetition of shapes, the spacing of symbols, the way some marks were fresher than others, as if someone returned periodically. Over the following days, they began to notice other subtle traces that seemed to connect these locations. A ribbon caught on a branch that matched a color in the greenhouse sketches. A pebble placed precisely at the edge of the clearing, a single feather laid across a sunlit stone. None of it screamed for attention. Instead, Each piece suggested a quiet mind attuned to observation and order, leaving small invitations for someone to notice, to reflect, to remember. Ellie returned to the mill one late afternoon, retracing her previous steps, listening to the soft creak of boards and the faint drip of condensation from the rafters. The light through the broken windows painted elongated shadows that moved subtly with the sun. She noticed a faint draft in the loft corner, and beneath a dusty beam, a small bundle of sticks tied together with string. Inside, more notes, each carefully folded, some with sketches of the riverbank, some with observations about the fog and how it settled in different parts of the town at different hours. Thomas joined her again, and they discussed what they had found. Their conversation was slow, reflective, punctuated by long silences as they listened to the rhythm of the mill itself, the gentle groan of wood, the distant murmur of the river, the occasional whistle of wind through a loose shutter. "It's like she's mapping the town in a language only we're beginning to understand," Thomas murmured. Evenings were quiet and contemplative. Ellie would sit by her window, notebook open, recording every detail. The sound of the wind through a broken gutter, the smell of damp earth drifting from the mill, the faint glimmer of light in an abandoned window down the street. Sometimes she imagined Margaret's movements, deliberate and patient, leaving traces that were meant to be found slowly, carefully, by those willing to pay attention. One particularly calm morning, Ellie wandered to the outskirts of town, where a field of tall grass bordered a line of pines. The ground was soft and springy, and each step released a whisper as stalks bent beneath her weight. At the edge of the field, she noticed a shallow depression, almost like a small amphitheater, surrounded by wildflowers and ferns. On the outer edge lay a series of smooth stones, each etched with a faint symbol. She crouched, tracing the markings, feeling the faint grooves, listening to the wind stir the grass, and realized that each stone seemed deliberately placed, forming a quiet path leading toward the forest beyond. Ellie felt, more than saw, a rhythm in the environment, the measured cadence of small actions repeated over time, a language written in objects, light, sound, and placement. The fog drifted in from the trees, wrapping the field in a soft gray veil, the distant call of birds punctuating the hush of early morning. She paused, letting the moment linger, knowing that this quiet persistence was the essence of Margaret's presence, subtle, deliberate, and patient, inviting observation rather than demanding explanation. And so, the investigation unfolded, day by day, discovery by discovery, each new location and small detail adding another layer to the delicate tapestry of traces that Margaret had left behind. The town remained calm, ordinary, its rhythms unchanged, yet Ellie and Thomas had begun to perceive the hidden pulse beneath its surface, the soft insistence of presence that whispered in the spaces most others overlooked. A few days later, Ellie ventured toward the western outskirts of Willowbrook, a place where the town's neat grid gave way to irregular paths and the forest began to reclaim abandoned cottages. The air was crisp and tinged with pine, and a distant hum of insects mixed with the soft gurgle of a creek that wound through the undergrowth. Each step released the subtle scent of damp leaves and soil, grounding her in the quiet rhythm of the land. She came upon a narrow lane lined with moss-covered stone walls. The stones were cold and rough beneath her fingertips, damp from recent rain, and the path between them was scattered with small, flattened leaves that crackled softly under her shoes. Near one wall, she noticed the faint imprint of a footstep, small and careful, pressed into the soft earth in a pattern that seemed deliberate, almost like a slow invitation to follow. She traced the prints gently with her finger, curious but patient, before continuing along the lane. At the lane's end, she discovered a long-abandoned greenhouse, smaller than the one near the forest clearing, its panes fogged with condensation. Inside, the scent of damp soil and rotting leaves was stronger, mingling with the faint sweetness of wildflowers that had taken root in neglected pots. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the glass, scattering tiny rainbows across the floorboards. On a low bench, a series of tiny clay figurines were arranged in a loose circle, each one shaped like a small animal. Foxes, rabbits, birds, smooth and worn, as if touched repeatedly over time. Ellie crouched to examine them, noticing faint scratches at their bases, symbols she did not recognize, but which repeated patterns she had seen in previous discoveries. In the carvings on the stone bridge, in the markings beneath the forest bridge, even in the small pebbles along the riverbank. She felt the soft weight of connection between these traces, a subtle thread weaving through the town's quiet spaces. Thomas joined her that afternoon, the faint rustle of his coat blending with the creak of the greenhouse door. He moved slowly, touching the wooden shelves lightly, tracing the cracked glass panes. She had an eye for detail, he said, voice low, almost reverent. Every object placed deliberately. Everything has a pattern, if you're patient enough to notice. Together they explored the surrounding area, stepping into a narrow path that led to an overgrown orchard. The grass was long and damp, brushing against their ankles, and the branches above swayed gently in a wind that carried the faint, sweet scent of apples. In the orchard, Ellie discovered a series of small wooden stakes, each topped with a tiny ribbon in shades of blue and green. The stakes were spaced at irregular intervals, forming a winding path toward a thicket at the far edge. When she brushed aside the undergrowth, she found a low stone bench hidden beneath tangled vines, and beneath it, another folded note, its edges softened with age. Time passes, but the quiet remembers. The words seem to linger in the air, mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. Ellie ran her fingers over the bench's rough surface, noting the slight warmth in the stone where sunlight had struck earlier. Thomas observed her quietly, then knelt to examine faint indentations in the soil around the bench, traces of careful movement, deliberate placement, as if someone had settled here often, but without disturbing the larger landscape. Later, they explored the path leading out of the orchard, discovering a narrow boardwalk that stretched over a small wetland. The wood beneath their feet was dark and slick with moss, the surface yielding slightly with each step. Beneath the boardwalk, reeds whispered in the water, and the faint splash of fish breaking the surface provided a steady, gentle rhythm. At one point, Ellie noticed a cluster of tiny, smooth stones arranged in a loose spiral at the water's edge, each one catching the sunlight at a slightly different angle, creating a quiet, shifting pattern of reflections on the surface. They paused there, listening to the soft symphony of the wetland, the gentle lapping of water against the boards, the wind through the reeds, the distant call of a heron. Thomas leaned closer and whispered, "It's like she's leaving us a trail in textures, light, sound, almost everything, if we pay attention." Over the next days, Ellie returned frequently to the orchard, the greenhouse, and the wetlands. She began noticing subtler elements. The faint scratches on tree bark near the orchard, suggesting repeated visits. The irregular placement of stones along the creek, forming lines or clusters that only became meaningful when viewed over time. The slight variations in light through the greenhouse panes, hinting at the changing hours of her previous visits. Evenings became a time for reflection. She would sit at her desk, feeling the warmth of the lamp, the rough texture of her notebook, the faint scent of ink and paper. She cataloged each detail carefully: the softness of moss underfoot, the sound of wind shifting leaves in the pines, the chill of stone benches kissed by the sun, the subtle rustle of tiny creatures moving unseen. The town itself felt alive in these quiet, overlooked spaces, each subtle discovery layering another quiet dimension onto the map of Margaret's presence. Ellie and Thomas would meet to discuss their observations, often walking in silence before speaking, letting the small details speak first. They noticed the way shadows shifted across locations at different times of day, the lingering sense of flowers and damp earth, the textures of objects touched repeatedly over years. Each observation deepened their understanding of the deliberate patience behind these traces, yet the true meaning remained just out of reach. Sometimes, in the hush of evening, Ellie would hear the faintest sound of laughter carried by the wind, soft and distant, or the quiet tap of a branch brushing against the greenhouse. The traces remained subtle, persistent, and patient, an invisible thread woven through the town, connecting the orchard, the wetlands, the greenhouse, the river, and the Hawthorne house. Each day, each step, each observation brought them closer to perceiving the rhythm of Margaret's presence. But the full story was still a quiet mystery, unfolding slowly, deliberately, like the fog that lingered along Willowbrook's edges. Ellie's next exploration led her toward the eastern edge of Willowbrook, where the town gave way to meadows and low hills dotted with abandoned cottages. The path was narrow, lined with tall grasses that bent softly in the wind, brushing her hands and releasing the earthy scent of wildflowers and damp soil. Each step made a gentle crunching sound, harmonizing with the distant call of a lone bird and the soft, steady murmur of a creek winding through the valley. She discovered a small, sunken garden behind one of the cottages. Its walls, made of crumbling stone, were coated in moss, and the soil was loose and dark, still rich despite years of neglect. In the center of the garden, she noticed a circle of flat stones partially buried in the earth, arranged in a way that suggested care rather than randomness. Nestled between the stones were tiny clumps of dried flowers, faded in color but arranged in delicate patterns. As she leaned closer, she could smell the subtle sweetness of the petals mingled with the damp moss and the faint metallic tang of the earth. Among the stones lay a small, folded piece of paper, edges softened by moisture. She unfolded it carefully and read the words, faintly smudged. "Paths are made not for wandering, but for noticing." She pressed the note into her notebook and traced the shapes of the stones with her fingers, feeling the subtle indentations, the roughness of moss, the way the sun falling through the clouds accentuated the textures. Each detail seemed purposeful, deliberate, an unspoken invitation to pause and observe. Later, she wandered along the edge of a shallow pond fed by the creek. The surface of the water reflected a pale gray sky, broken by occasional ripples from fish beneath. She noticed small piles of twigs and reeds carefully stacked at irregular intervals along the bank, each topped with a smooth pebble or a fallen leaf arranged in an unusual pattern. When she bent to examine one, a faint ripple of movement from the reeds suggested something had shifted, a fish, perhaps, or something smaller, unseen. The soft splash and rustle of life beneath the surface added to the meditative stillness of the scene. Thomas joined her in the late afternoon, carrying a small pack with water and notebooks. They moved slowly along the pond, speaking in whispers, pausing often to note subtle patterns. A feather caught in the reeds, parallel to the ripples in the water. The way the light shifted through the thin clouds and illuminated small patches of moss along the bank. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, each step a muted percussion in the quiet. Near the far edge of the pond, they discovered a narrow footbridge, weathered but sturdy, leading to a small clearing in the trees beyond. The wooden planks were dark with age, slick in places with moisture, and the railing was wrapped in creeping vines. Beneath the bridge, the water whispered against rocks, sending faint echoes up through the structure. On one post of the railing, etched delicately into the wood, were initials and a date. Old, but not faded beyond recognition. Ellie ran her fingers over the grooves, noting their smoothness from repeated contact. The clearing beyond the bridge was small and quiet, framed by pines and low shrubs. Sunlight filtered through the branches and scattered beams, illuminating patches of wildflowers and small mounds of earth. Ellie noticed tiny footprints in the soft soil, some human, some perhaps animal, and the faint impression of objects moved carefully to the edges. A small cluster of stones, arranged in a spiral, caught her attention, echoing the spiral pattern she had seen beneath the forest bridge weeks earlier. She crouched, feeling the roughness of each stone, noting the slight warmth from the sun and the faint cool draft through the clearing. Thomas knelt beside her, observing quietly. "The patterns repeat," he murmured. "Not exactly the same, but the same attention to detail. Everything is deliberate, even the smallest traces." They moved slowly back along the footbridge, each step measured to avoid disturbing the moss and leaves. Ellie noticed a faint sound on the breeze, a soft chime, as if from a wind bell, though no bell was visible. The sound was delicate, almost imperceptible, and it seemed to follow them for a moment before fading into the hum of insects and the gentle ripple of the pond. Over the next week, Ellie returned to the clearing several times, always noticing something new. A leaf with tiny notches cut along its edge, arranged in a subtle pattern. A cluster of pine cones stacked carefully at the base of a tree. The way the sunlight shifted across the mounds of earth as the days passed, illuminating different details each time. Each discovery felt like a quiet conversation with Margaret, an invitation to perceive the world in the slow, deliberate way she had chosen. Evenings were spent documenting, reflecting, and sharing observations with Thomas. They spoke quietly about the connections between locations: the orchard, the wetlands, the hawthorn house, the ponds and clearings, and the deliberate placement of objects, marks, and patterns. Each observation deepened their awareness of Margaret's subtle language, one that relied on texture, light, shadow, sound, and movement rather than words alone. On one particularly still morning, Ellie paused at the edge of a small hill overlooking the town. The fog lingered low in the streets and over the river, softening the edges of buildings and trees. She could hear the distant trickle of the creek, the gentle rustle of reeds, the faint call of a bird somewhere in the woods. She traced her gaze across the landscape, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the patterns of human and natural presence, and felt, more than saw, the persistent thread of Margaret's traces winding quietly through the town, patient, deliberate, and unhurried. Ellie breathed deeply, feeling the textures, sounds, and subtle shifts around her. The town was calm and ordinary, yet beneath the surface, a quiet rhythm pulsed. Traces of attention, care, and lingering presence, patiently waiting to be noticed, slowly, one careful step at a time. A few mornings later, Ellie wandered down a quiet lane that led toward the southern edge of Willowbrook, a place where the pavement gave way to soft dirt paths and scattered wildflowers. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet grass and distant wood smoke. Each step stirred the delicate perfume of crushed leaves, and the faint buzz of bees drifted from a hidden cluster of blossoms. Light filtered softly through the low-hanging branches, casting a dappled pattern on the ground, and the quiet hum of the town behind her felt distant, almost unreal. At the edge of the path, she discovered a small, abandoned railway siding, the tracks overgrown with moss and small saplings. The steel rails were dark with age, cold and smooth beneath her fingertips, and the wooden ties creaked faintly under her weight. A few discarded items were scattered along the line: a broken lantern, a coil of frayed rope, and a tiny, rusted bell that tinkled softly when nudged by the breeze. She crouched, brushing the rust from the bell with her fingers, and noticed a faint inscription on its side, a looping letter and a number, so small it could easily have been missed. Thomas arrived mid-morning, stepping lightly on the rails, his boots making the softest thuds. Together they traced the line, noticing subtle signs along the way. Indentations in the soil, as though someone had walked here carefully. A series of small stones placed in a loose line parallel to the tracks. A leaf pinned under a rock, its veins etched clearly by dew and time. "She seems to mark movement," Thomas said quietly, kneeling to examine the stones. "Not just places, but the way someone moves through them." Further down, the track ended at a low hill overlooking the river. Here, the land opened into a small meadow where wildflowers and grasses swayed in a gentle rhythm with the breeze. In the center of the meadow was a cluster of stones, roughly circular, with small piles of earth at their bases. Ellie knelt, tracing the subtle depressions in the soil and the faint, almost imperceptible scratches along the stone's surfaces. Each mark felt intentional, carefully repeated, like a slow, meditative practice. Beyond the meadow, a narrow, winding path led to an old orchard, separate from the one they had explored before. The trees here were shorter, their branches gnarled and twisted, the bark rough against her hands. Sunlight sifted through the leaves, illuminating the dust motes in the air and highlighting faint shapes pressed into the grass. A footprint here, the outline of a fallen branch carefully placed there, a small nest of twigs arranged in a deliberate triangle. Ellie ran her hand over the grass, feeling the difference in texture where each impression had been made, and noted how the subtle changes in elevation and shadow seemed to guide the eye, encouraging close observation rather than rushing past. A faint, distant sound drew her attention, a soft scraping, as if a stick had been dragged along the earth. She followed it slowly, and at the edge of the orchard, discovered a shallow ditch partially concealed by ferns. Within, she found a small, weathered box, its surface smooth from years of handling. Opening it, she discovered folded scraps of paper, each with brief observations: the direction of wind, the movement of clouds, the timing of birds' calls, and sometimes the faint sketch of an animal or plant. One note read, "Even small movements leave echoes. Listen for them." Thomas joined her again, crouching to examine the box. He ran a finger over the notes and sketches, noting their precision. "It's like she's teaching us how to pay attention," he murmured. "Everything has rhythm and pattern, even when it seems ordinary. As the afternoon light shifted, they followed a narrow deer trail into a secluded copse. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles, and the air smelled of wet bark and soil. Ellie paused often, listening to the faint rustle of small animals, the distant drip of water from leaves, and the subtle creak of branches swaying in the breeze. Hidden beneath a low-hanging branch, she found a small, carved wooden token, smooth and rounded, etched with symbols she did not recognize. The wood was warm from the sun, and she could feel the texture of each carved groove beneath her fingertips. The copse opened onto a tiny pond, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the surrounding trees in muted green and gray tones. Along the bank, she noticed a series of reeds bent in a careful pattern, their tips dipping lightly into the water, and a cluster of smooth stones arranged like a miniature labyrinth. She ran her fingers across the pebbles, feeling the subtle differences in temperature, texture, and shape, noting how each element seemed to interact with the others, creating a quiet, deliberate composition. Thomas observed in silence, occasionally pointing out faint traces Ellie might have missed. A leaf caught in the curve of a stone, the faint imprint of footprints leading away from the water, the way the reeds swayed slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. Together, they recorded each detail, noting patterns and subtle connections between this location and the others: the orchard, the wetlands, the riverbank, and the Hawthorne house. As dusk fell, the light softened, and the forest seemed to exhale a slow, steady sigh. The wind carried faint scents of earth and pine. The water whispered over stones, and the distant hum of the town felt far away. Ellie and Thomas lingered, absorbing the calm, reflective atmosphere, understanding that each discovery, each stone, footprint, sketch, or note, was part of a deliberate, unhurried rhythm. Margaret's presence, patient and subtle, remained just beyond full comprehension, guiding them gently through the quiet spaces of Willowbrook, one careful observation at a time. A few mornings later, Ellie decided to explore the western hills beyond the river, a place where the landscape rose gently into rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers and scattered stone outcroppings. The air was cool and carried a faint, sweet aroma of damp grass, mingled with the subtle scent of river water drifting over the low banks. Each step through the soft, uneven ground released a muted crunch of soil and fallen leaves, and the faint hum of insects harmonized with the distant trickle of water from hidden streams. Near the crest of one hill, she noticed a narrow trail leading into a copse of low oaks. The trunks were knotted and rough beneath her hands, and the forest floor was soft with moss, pine needles, and tiny, scattered acorns. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, shifting beams, illuminating patches of wildflowers and casting delicate shadows that moved as the wind brushed the leaves. A subtle, rhythmic rustle caught her attention, and she paused, listening to a faint tapping sound, perhaps the claws of a squirrel on a branch or a stick brushing against bark, but there was an odd regularity to it, almost deliberate. Following the sound, Ellie found a small hollow at the base of a tree, partially concealed by moss and fallen leaves. Inside, she discovered a carefully arranged pile of twigs, leaves, and a smooth river stone resting on top. The stone was cool and slightly damp from the morning dew, and the twigs were laid in a precise, radiating pattern, as if forming a miniature compass. She traced the lines with her fingertips, feeling the subtle textures, and noticed faint scratches on the stone, delicate marks that formed a tiny, abstract design. Thomas joined her just as the sun broke through a thin veil of clouds, scattering golden light across the hilltop. He knelt beside the hollow, pointing out the subtle indentations in the surrounding moss, the gentle slope of the earth, and the careful placement of small objects nearby. A feather caught in a tuft of grass, a cluster of smooth pebbles, and a single dried leaf balanced on the edge of the hollow. "She's marking space here," Thomas whispered, "not just with objects, but with the subtle shaping of her environment." They continued down the trail, which curved gently to the edge of a small, abandoned quarry. The rocks were gray and rough underfoot, the ground uneven, and the air smelled faintly of wet stone and moss. Patches of sunlight created shifting patterns on the walls, revealing tiny crevices where moss and lichen clung stubbornly. Ellie noticed faint traces along the ledges, the scuff of footprints pressed into soft soil, a small pile of leaves tucked carefully into a corner, a tiny shard of pottery that caught the light. Each element seemed deliberate, unhurried, and intended to draw attention in its own subtle way. Near the center of the quarry, she found a low stone bench partially hidden beneath an overhang, its surface rough and cool, streaked with lichen. Tucked beneath it was a small bundle wrapped in soft fabric, containing folded pieces of paper and a tiny carved figurine. A bird, its wings slightly spread, smooth from repeated handling. The papers held short, precise notes, observations about the angle of sunlight, the flow of water along the quarry floor, and sketches of plants and rocks in the surrounding area. One line read, "Even in stillness, there is direction." Thomas crouched beside her, carefully examining the figurine and papers. "It's like she's creating markers for someone who moves slowly," he said softly. "Each object, each note, it's all a guide for careful observation." As the afternoon deepened, they followed a faint path from the quarry that led to a secluded grove of alder trees, their bark smooth and pale, the ground beneath spongy with fallen leaves and soft moss. In the center of the grove was a shallow depression in the earth, surrounded by small stones and a few scattered pine cones. Ellie knelt to examine the site, noting tiny indentations in the soil that suggested repeated visits. Among the pine cones, she found a small, folded paper, edges softened and worn, with a simple line written in neat, looping script. Notice the patterns where light falls and shadows gather. She let her fingers linger on the paper, feeling the texture and weight of it, the faint impressions of handwriting pressed into the fibers. The grove was quiet except for the gentle whisper of wind through the alder leaves, the distant murmur of the river, and the soft hum of insects hidden in the undergrowth. Ellie and Thomas spent hours moving slowly through the grove, taking note of every subtle detail. The angle of sunlight shifting through the branches, the way moss clung to stones, the careful arrangement of leaves and small branches. Each observation deepened their sense of Margaret's patient attention, her deliberate shaping of spaces to communicate without words. As the sun began to dip, casting a warm, muted glow across the hills, they stood quietly at the edge of the grove, absorbing the textures, sounds, and subtle rhythms of the landscape. The traces were everywhere, in stones, leaves, light, and shadow, but never obtrusive. Each small discovery invited reflection, an awareness of patience and presence, guiding them gently, step by careful step, deeper into the quiet patterns that Margaret had left woven through Willowbrook. And as they retraced their steps toward the town, the wind carried the soft rustle of leaves, the distant drip of water, and the faint, rhythmic hum of the forest, reminding them that the mystery was still unfolding deliberate and unhurried, in every quiet corner they had yet to explore. A few mornings later, Ellie set out along the eastern edge of the town, where Willowbrook faded into open fields and the faint outlines of old stone walls. The air was crisp, carrying a subtle mix of damp earth and the faint sweetness of wildflowers hidden among the tall grasses. Her steps pressed softly into the soil, leaving delicate impressions that were quickly filled by the wind, as if the land itself preferred quiet secrecy. She came upon a narrow, winding path she had never noticed before. It sloped gently between two low hills, the sides dotted with scattered stones and wild ferns. Sunlight filtered in scattered beams through the sparse canopy of birches overhead, catching the fine hairs on leaves and casting faint shadows that shifted slowly with the movement of the morning breeze. The faint hum of insects mingled with the distant trickle of water from a small, hidden stream that ran alongside the path, producing a gentle, steady rhythm. Halfway along the trail, Ellie noticed a shallow depression in the ground, partially covered by fallen leaves. Kneeling, she brushed them aside and discovered a small collection of smooth pebbles arranged in a circle. Each stone was carefully positioned, and their surfaces bore subtle scratches, lines and curves that seemed intentional, almost like a quiet alphabet of marks. She touched them lightly, feeling the slight difference in texture and temperature between each one, as if the stones themselves held a trace of the hand that placed them. Further along the path, the stream widened slightly into a small pool surrounded by reeds and wildflowers. Here, the air smelled faintly of water and earth, with a soft, sweet undertone from the blooms that edged the bank. Ellie crouched at the water's edge and noticed tiny ripples forming patterns, disturbed by small fish or insects, but arranged in ways that seemed to echo the spirals she had seen in the quarry and the wetlands. On a low branch above, a single feather had been carefully tucked, its tip dipping slightly into the water, casting a delicate shadow across the surface. Thomas arrived later, moving quietly along the path, his boots leaving soft impressions in the damp soil. He paused beside the pool, noting the gentle arrangement of reeds, stones, and the feather. "It's deliberate," he whispered. "Not random. Every little detail seems designed to be seen slowly, carefully." They followed the stream to a small wooden bridge, aged and worn but solid. The boards creaked softly beneath their weight, and the railing, covered in lichen, was rough and cool to the touch. Beneath the bridge, the water gurgled over stones, producing a faint, soothing murmur. On one post, a tiny carving caught Ellie's eye, a delicate spiral with a faint scratch through the center, echoing patterns she had encountered before. Beyond the bridge, the path opened onto a gentle slope leading to a low hill, where a circle of ancient oaks stood. Their trunks were broad and textured, the bark rough and cool under her hands. In the center of the grove, the ground was uneven, patches of moss and ferns rising like miniature hills. Ellie noticed small mounds of earth, arranged carefully, each topped with a pebble, a leaf, or a fragment of bark. She knelt to examine one, tracing faint indentations in the soil that suggested repeated visits, small gestures, and an attentive eye to detail. Thomas crouched nearby, observing the subtle arrangements. "She's leaving a language in the landscape," he said softly. "It's quiet, patient, but it's consistent. You can feel the pattern once you start noticing." They moved slowly through the grove, listening to the soft whisper of leaves in the wind, the gentle hum of insects, the distant call of a bird hidden in the trees. Ellie paused at a small cluster of stones near the edge of the clearing, noticing a tiny scrap of paper tucked beneath one. It was faded, the ink soft, but the message was clear. Observe without haste. Presence speaks in small gestures. The words lingered as they continued, and Ellie felt the rhythm of the grove settle into her awareness. The careful placement of stones, the alignment of leaves and feathers, the subtle shaping of moss and earth. Each discovery was quiet, deliberate, and unhurried, inviting reflection rather than immediate understanding. As the afternoon light shifted, long, soft shadows stretched across the grove. Sunlight caught on the edges of leaves, illuminating tiny patterns of veins and textures Ellie had not noticed before. The forest seemed to breathe with them, slow and measured, carrying the scent of damp moss, pine, and earth. Every sound, the gentle ripple of the stream, the creak of the bridge, the soft rustle of leaves, wove into a calm, steady rhythm that guided their movements, revealing the delicate traces Margaret had left across Willowbrook in ways subtle, deliberate, and patient. By the time they left the grove, the sun was low, casting muted gold across the hills. Ellie felt the quiet weight of discovery pressing gently against her consciousness. Each location, each object, each mark was a whisper of presence, waiting for careful eyes, patient hands, and quiet minds to notice. And in that calm, unhurried awareness, the mystery remained alive, unfolding softly, layer by careful layer, as the town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next small, deliberate observation. The next morning, Ellie set out toward the northern marshes, a quiet stretch of land where Willowbrook streets dissolved into reeds and shallow pools. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth, mingled with faint traces of wildflowers and decaying vegetation. Each step through the soft, springy soil released a gentle squelch, and the low hum of insects mingled with the distant drip of water from moss-laden trees. Light filtered through the thin mist, scattering in pale, muted beams that illuminated tiny droplets clinging to reeds and grasses. She noticed a narrow boardwalk, partially sunken and weathered, stretching across a cluster of pools. The wood was rough and cold beneath her fingers, slick in patches with moss and dew. As she walked slowly, she could hear the water murmuring beneath the planks, a quiet, rhythmic accompaniment to her measured steps. Near the center of the marsh, she paused, drawn by a subtle shimmer in the reeds. A small collection of smooth stones, partially submerged, formed a pattern she did not immediately recognize. Some piled in tiny stacks, others laid flat with faint scratches along their surfaces. Thomas arrived shortly after, stepping carefully onto the boardwalk. He crouched to examine the stones, pointing out faint trails of mud leading from one pool to another. She's mapping the movement of water, or maybe movement in general, he whispered, tracing the line of footprints that shifted in size and spacing. There's intention here, in the way these traces interact with the environment. Ellie noticed a narrow path of flattened reeds leading toward a small grove of silver birches. The bark was pale and smooth beneath her hands, and the ground beneath was soft, layered with fallen leaves and moss. At the edge of the grove, she discovered a shallow depression in the soil where a cluster of reeds had been tied together with fine string, forming a miniature structure. Inside, a tiny bundle of dried flowers rested, their color faded to soft browns and muted yellows. When she lifted the bundle, she found a note tucked beneath, ink smudged but legible. Even small gestures mark a presence. Watch for the quiet patterns. The grove was hushed, filled with the soft hum of insects and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. A single bird called from the canopy above, its voice thin and distant. Ellie traced the edges of the depression with her fingertips, feeling the subtle changes in texture, the way the moss rose slightly around the base, the faint depressions where repeated visits had pressed the earth. They moved deeper into the grove, discovering a small, sunken pond shaded by birches. The surface was still, reflecting the pale sky, and the edges were lined with reeds that swayed with a faint rhythm in the wind. On a low branch above the water, Ellie noticed a tiny wooden charm tied with thread, dangling gently and casting a moving shadow across the pond. The wood was smooth and warm from sunlight, and she could feel the delicate grooves etched into its surface. Thomas observed quietly, pointing out subtle signs she might have missed. A small pile of pebbles at the water's edge, a line of twigs pressed into soft mud, faint animal tracks weaving carefully between reeds. "It's like she's teaching us patience," he said softly. "Notice slowly. Every detail matters, and nothing is accidental." They lingered for a long while, absorbing the atmosphere. The gentle ripple of water, the faint buzz of insects, the soft sway of reeds and branches. Each object, each mark, each pattern became part of a quiet, deliberate rhythm. Ellie could feel the presence of someone who had moved carefully through the same spaces, leaving traces not to shock or surprise, but to invite awareness, reflection, and careful attention. As the sun began to dip, scattering pale gold across the marsh, Ellie followed a faint trail of flattened grass leading to a low hill at the edge of the wetlands. Here, the mist hung thick in the hollows, softening edges and muting sound. At the top of the hill, she discovered a small stone circle, partially overgrown with moss. Each stone was smooth, cool, and worn, with faint scratches and tiny indentations along the surface. In the center lay a folded scrap of paper, edges softened with moisture. Presence lingers quietly, in every shape, shadow, and step. Ellie let her fingers linger on the paper, feeling the texture and the weight of it, absorbing the soft hush of the surroundings, the gentle hum of insects, the whisper of the breeze, the faint murmur of water in the distance. The marsh, the grove, the pond, the hill, all seemed connected by invisible threads of intention and care, each small discovery layering another quiet, deliberate piece onto the slow, unfolding map of Margaret's presence. Thomas crouched beside her, tracing the outlines of stones and moss. "Everywhere we go, she leaves a rhythm," he murmured, "a quiet cadence that only reveals itself to patient eyes." Ellie nodded, breathing in the faint, damp scent of the wetlands, the warmth of sun-soaked stones, the subtle vibration of life around her. The traces remained gentle, deliberate, patient, an unhurried language written in texture, light, sound, and shadow. And as the mist thickened over the valley, the quiet patterns of the marsh whispered softly around them, reminding them that the story of Margaret's presence was still unfolding, layer by deliberate layer, in spaces that few would ever notice unless they moved slowly enough to perceive it. The following afternoon, Ellie made her way toward the western cliffs, where the forest thinned and low, rocky outcrops overlooked a shallow valley. The wind here was soft but steady, carrying the faint tang of damp stone and moss, mingled with distant hints of wildflowers growing in hidden crevices. Each step over the uneven rocks produced a muted crunch, the texture rough beneath her fingers, the stones cool even where sunlight struck them. The valley below was quiet, the hum of distant insects blending with the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the breeze. She discovered a narrow ledge, just wide enough to walk slowly, where tiny tufts of grass had taken root between the cracks. On the ledge, a small cairn had been carefully stacked, each stone balanced precisely atop the other. Some bore faint grooves, almost like the marks of fingernails pressing them into place, while others were scratched with shallow lines forming subtle, abstract patterns. Ellie ran her fingers over the stones, feeling the smooth surfaces and the faint warmth where the sun had struck. A little further along the ledge, she found a tiny hollow carved into the rock. Inside, a few delicate objects rested: a dried sprig of lavender, a single feather, and a folded scrap of paper with words written in faded ink. Edges define space. Watch how shadows shift with movement. The sunlight here was softer, filtered through high clouds, and the rocks cast long, delicate shadows that shifted slowly with the breeze. Ellie paused, letting the quiet fill her senses. The faint scrape of wind against stone, the distant trickle of a stream far below, the soft hum of insects hidden in the grass. Each small detail felt purposeful, part of a subtle rhythm connecting place, object, and observation. Thomas joined her, stepping lightly across the rocks, his hands brushing the rough surfaces for balance. He crouched beside the hollow, observing the placement of objects and the way the light fell across them. "She's leaving traces for someone who moves carefully," he whispered. "Not hurried, patient, attentive to the smallest rhythms." They continued along the cliff, discovering another hidden ledge that sloped down toward a tiny, secluded grove at the base. The path to the grove was narrow and soft with moss, the air damp and cool. Ellie noticed faint depressions in the moss, like footsteps pressed repeatedly over time, leading to a shallow stone basin nestled among the roots of an old oak. Inside the basin lay a collection of small pebbles, each one smooth and warm from sunlight filtering through the leaves, arranged in concentric rings. A single pine cone rested at the center. Thomas knelt beside the basin, gently tracing the edges of the stones. "She's creating patterns that you only notice if you take the time," he murmured. "Patterns that encourage quiet observation, reflection." Beyond the grove, a narrow stream wound through the rocks, its surface glinting faintly in the filtered light. Ellie followed it slowly, listening to the gentle gurgle of water over stones and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. On one bank, she discovered a small patch of reeds bent carefully in a delicate zigzag pattern, and a few smooth stones placed at intervals along the water's edge. The placement was subtle, almost imperceptible unless one paused and observed. At the far end of the stream, they found a low wooden footbridge, weathered and moss-covered, leading to a shallow clearing. The bridge creaked softly under their weight, and the air smelled faintly of wet wood, earth, and the faint sweetness of hidden flowers. In the center of the clearing, a circle of flat stones formed a gentle spiral, each stone slightly raised and angled toward the center. Ellie knelt, feeling the smoothness of the stones and tracing the shallow indentations along their edges. A scrap of paper tucked beneath one stone bore a single line. "Patterns are everywhere. Listen with your eyes, feel with your hands." They lingered in the clearing for some time, letting the quiet fill them, the gentle gurgle of the stream, the rustle of leaves, the soft hum of hidden insects, the distant bird call. Each object, each mark, each trace felt deliberate, a gentle pulse guiding them through the space. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, soft shadows across the clearing, Ellie and Thomas retraced their steps toward the cliffs. Every stone, leaf, feather, and groove seemed to hum with intention, a quiet language written in texture, light, and shadow. The traces persisted patiently, deliberate and unhurried, weaving a subtle, intricate map across Willowbrook that was still waiting for careful eyes to perceive, layer by layer, step by quiet step. A few mornings later, Ellie wandered along a narrow lane on the outskirts of Willowbrook that led to the remnants of an old mill, long abandoned and softened by time. The lane was bordered by tall grasses, their tips brushing softly against her arms, releasing faint earthy scents mingled with wildflowers hidden in the edges. The air was cool, carrying the faint metallic tang of old machinery rusting slowly beneath the elements. Her footsteps pressed lightly against the soft soil, muted by fallen leaves that crunched only faintly beneath her careful steps. The mill itself was a low stone building, its walls mottled with moss and lichen, windows clouded with dust and streaked with age. Inside, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp wood and stone. Sunlight fell in muted beams through cracks in the roof, catching motes of dust that floated lazily in the quiet space. On a low workbench, Ellie noticed a series of small, carefully arranged objects: a coil of thin wire, a smooth river stone, and a single feather resting atop a folded scrap of paper. She ran her fingers over the objects, noting the subtle textures, the cold smoothness of the stone, the delicate softness of the feather, the fine, almost brittle thread of the wire. Thomas arrived shortly, stepping quietly on the worn wooden floorboards. He leaned closer to examine the paper, noticing faint handwriting that had faded with time. "She leaves these almost like reminders," he whispered, tracing the lines of ink. "Not urgent messages, but quiet invitations to notice." They moved slowly through the mill, exploring its corners where shadows pooled and beams of light caught on surfaces in unusual ways. In one shadowed nook, Ellie discovered a small wooden box partially hidden beneath a rotting beam. The box was light and smooth in her hands, and inside were folded notes, each containing a brief observation: the angle of sunlight through a particular window, the pattern of cracks in the floorboards, and the faint sound of wind moving through the broken roof. One note read, "Even silence leaves traces. Listen for them in corners and shadows." Outside, the mill's wheel lay still, moss climbing over its wooden spokes. Ellie stepped onto the soft earth beneath it and noticed subtle impressions in the soil, shallow depressions arranged in a rough spiral. Small twigs and pebbles had been placed deliberately along the edges, catching the faint afternoon light and casting tiny, shifting shadows. She traced the lines with her fingers, feeling the faint differences in texture where the earth had been pressed more firmly, where moss had softened the edges. They followed a faint path from the mill into a nearby orchard, different from those they had explored before. The trees here were older, their trunks wide and twisted, bark rough and cracked beneath their hands. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, moss, and the occasional small fruit that had dropped and begun to decay. Ellie noticed a tiny stone circle at the base of one tree, within it a carefully arranged stack of sticks topped with a feather, echoing patterns they had seen along the river, the wetlands, and the cliffs. Thomas crouched beside her, running his fingers along the edges of the sticks and stones. "Everything is deliberate," he said softly. "Even small objects are positioned to guide attention, to invite patience." They followed a narrow trail that led from the orchard to a small, hidden clearing in the forest. Sunlight filtered through high branches, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the soft earth. In the center of the clearing, Ellie noticed a shallow depression lined with moss, the edges marked with faint scratches and small stones placed at irregular intervals. A tiny bundle of dried flowers rested inside, its petals faded to muted shades of brown and gold. Beneath it, a scrap of paper bore a single line. Patterns persist where quiet is preserved. The clearing was hushed except for the soft whisper of leaves, the gentle ripple of a distant creek, and the faint hum of insects. Ellie ran her fingers over the moss and the stones, feeling the slight warmth from sunlight, the texture of earth softened by repeated touch, and the subtle shifts of shadow as clouds moved overhead. Thomas observed quietly, noting the arrangement of each element, the careful spacing, the way the small details guided the eye towards subtle interactions between objects, light, and movement. "She teaches through observation," he murmured, "through the small and patient acts that most people overlook." As the sun dipped lower, casting long, soft shadows across the clearing, Ellie felt the rhythm of the space settle into her awareness. Every stone, leaf, feather, and mark carried intention, a deliberate cadence linking the mill, the orchard, the river, and the wetlands. The traces persisted quietly, patiently, inviting careful attention, a calm language of presence woven across the landscape of Willowbrook. And as they left the clearing, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint hum of water, the rustle of leaves, and the soft vibration of life, reminding them that the quiet patterns Margaret had left were still unfolding, deliberate and unhurried, waiting to be discovered one patient step at a time. The next morning, Ellie took a quiet path along the southern edge of Willowbrook, where the land sloped gently toward a shallow, mist-filled valley. The fog hung low over the grasses, softening colors and muting sound, and each step pressed into soil damp from overnight dew, releasing a faint, earthy scent. The air carried a subtle sweetness from wildflowers hidden in the undergrowth, mingled with the faint tang of wet moss and stone. Overhead, the pale sunlight filtered through the mist in soft, scattered beams, illuminating droplets that clung to leaves and grasses. Along the edge of the valley, she found a narrow, overgrown trail lined with low stone walls. The stones were rough beneath her hands, mottled with lichen and moss, and the walls leaned gently in places, softened by years of weathering. In a shallow hollow between two stones, a small pile of twigs had been carefully arranged into a miniature structure, topped with a single feather. She knelt to examine it, feeling the textures, the rough twigs, the soft feather, the slightly damp earth beneath her fingertips. A scrap of faded paper lay tucked beneath the arrangement. Small gestures persist where stillness is honored. Thomas arrived quietly, stepping lightly to avoid disturbing the fragile arrangement. He crouched beside her, observing the placement of twigs and feather, and tracing faint marks along the stone surfaces. "Notice how each element interacts with its surroundings," he murmured. "The way shadows fall, the texture of the earth, the slight tilt of each twig. Every detail seems intentional." They followed the trail further into the valley, where the ground flattened into a broad meadow dotted with low, rounded mounds covered in grass and moss. The meadow was silent except for the gentle hum of insects and the soft ripple of wind brushing through the tall grasses. Near the center, Ellie noticed a series of small stones arranged in an irregular spiral. The stones were smooth, warm from sunlight, and some bore faint scratches in delicate, looping patterns. Around the spiral, Tiny impressions in the soil suggested careful steps, as though someone had walked slowly around the formation, observing and adjusting with patience. Further along the meadow, a narrow creek meandered gently between low banks lined with reeds and wildflowers. The water whispered softly over smooth stones, producing a gentle, steady rhythm. Ellie noticed tiny leaf bundles tucked between the reeds, each tied with thin threads and carefully weighted with small stones. Some leaves had faint markings etched along their edges, almost like a code, while others were folded precisely. The faint, sweet scent of wet vegetation mingled with the earthy aroma of the soil, creating a calming, immersive atmosphere. Thomas leaned down to examine a bundle, brushing his fingers over the threads and leaves. "It's deliberate," he said softly. "Not just the placement of objects, but the interaction with water, light, and wind. Each element seems chosen to create attention, patience, awareness." They continued along the creek to a small grove of young oaks, the ground soft with moss, leaves, and small fallen acorns. In a shaded nook beneath a low-hanging branch, Ellie found a shallow stone basin, its surface worn smooth and slightly warm from the sun above. Inside, a tiny arrangement of pine cones, twigs, and pebbles formed a careful, symmetrical pattern. A single feather rested atop the center, and a scrap of paper, faded and soft, bore a single line. Presence is revealed slowly, through subtle repetition. The grove was still, filled only with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. Ellie ran her fingers over the edges of the stones and pine cones, noting the fine indentations where repeated handling had left subtle traces. The textures were varied: the roughness of bark, the smoothness of pebbles, the delicate softness of feathers, and each detail seemed connected to others she had seen across Willowbrook: the wetlands, the cliffs, the mill, and the orchards. Thomas observed quietly, tracing the outline of the pattern with gentle fingers. "Everywhere we go, she creates a rhythm," he whispered. "Not hurried or obvious, but patient, deliberate. The space itself teaches how to notice, to feel, to pay attention." As the sun began to dip, the light softened, casting long shadows across the grove. The air smelled faintly of wet moss and earth, and the gentle hum of insects rose in a slow, steady cadence. Ellie felt the quiet pulse of the landscape, the intentionality woven into each subtle mark, and the way every stone, feather, leaf, and scratch seemed to whisper presence and care. They lingered in the grove for a long while, absorbing the textures, sounds, and light, letting the rhythms settle into their awareness. The traces persisted patiently, deliberate and unhurried, a quiet, intricate language written across Willowbrook, waiting for careful eyes to perceive it. And as they finally rose and retraced their steps toward the town, the mist carried the soft murmur of the creek, the gentle sway of leaves, and the faint, deliberate pattern of Margaret's presence, still unfolding, layer by layer, in spaces that invited reflection, observation, and quiet patience. Over the following days, Ellie and Thomas continued their careful walks through Willowbrook, revisiting the orchards, the wetlands, the cliffs, and the hidden groves. At first, each location seemed a separate whisper of intention, a series of delicate patterns scattered across the landscape. But slowly, as they recorded each observation and compared notes, subtle connections began to emerge. A spiral here echoed the arrangement of twigs in the forest. A carefully stacked pile of stones mirrored a tiny cairn by the river, and the placement of feathers, leaves, and notes revealed an unhurried, repeating rhythm. One quiet afternoon, Ellie returned to the Hawthorne house, where Margaret had spent her last years. The air was still, heavy with the faint scent of wood polish and faded flowers. She walked slowly through the rooms, running her fingers along the edges of furniture, the worn fabric of chairs, the soft, faded carpet. Sitting on the windowsill, she noticed the sunlight falling in a precise angle, illuminating a small stack of papers that had gone unnoticed before. Thomas joined her, and together they unfolded the documents. The papers were diaries, sketches, and lists. Observations Margaret had made over years. Notes about the growth of trees in the orchards, the changing flow of the creek, patterns of wind and light, and careful sketches of stones, leaves, and small objects she had arranged across the town. Her writing was gentle, reflective, sometimes cryptic, but gradually, the pattern became clear. Margaret had been creating a network of quiet markers, subtle guides through Willowbrook, almost like a map of attention itself. She had wanted someone to see the world as she did, to notice the small, deliberate interactions between people, objects, and environment. Ellie traced her finger along the sketches, noting the repeated spiral patterns, the clusters of stones, the arrangements of feathers and leaves. Thomas spoke softly, almost to himself. She wasn't leaving puzzles, she was leaving invitations. Invitations to observe carefully, to move slowly, to notice presence in every detail. In the days that followed, they returned to each location, seeing it through this new understanding. The spirals, the stone circles, the hidden bundles, the small notes, all became part of a quiet language. Margaret's presence was not threatening or mysterious in the dramatic sense. It was gentle, deliberate, and patient. She had moved through Willowbrook with care, leaving traces that guided attentive eyes, encouraging reflection and calm awareness. At the orchard, Ellie noticed that the alignment of the trees, the careful placement of stones at their bases, and the small, folded notes all formed a pattern that matched the flow of sunlight and shadow throughout the day. In the wetlands, the arrangement of reeds and pebbles by the creek reflected an understanding of water, movement, and rhythm. On the cliffs, the cairns and hollows revealed a meditative practice of placement and repetition. Each discovery connected naturally to the next, forming a web of deliberate attention that could be traced across the landscape. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Willowbrook, casting warm light across the town and valleys, Ellie and Thomas sat quietly in the clearing by the pond. The reeds swayed softly, the water whispered over stones, and the hum of insects rose gently in the air. Ellie looked at the spirals of stones and the careful arrangement of twigs and feathers, understanding fully for the first time. Margaret had not left riddles or secrets to frighten, confuse, or challenge. She had left a record of her own way of noticing, a gentle invitation to experience the world slowly, to feel the rhythm of place and presence. Thomas leaned back against a tree, exhaling softly. "It's not about solving anything," he said. "It's about learning how she moved, how she saw. All those patterns, the care in everything. It's a guide to awareness." Ellie smiled quietly, touching the edge of a stone spiral. The patterns, once mysterious, now felt calm, deliberate, and soothing. She realized that Margaret's traces were complete, self-contained, and persistent, not a message in the traditional sense, but a legacy of quiet attention and reflective observation. As twilight settled over the valley, the town below softened in a gentle haze. The wind whispered through the reeds, the water rippled lightly against the banks, and the last light touched the tops of the trees. Ellie and Thomas rose slowly, moving back along the paths, each stone, feather, and leaf now resonating with understanding. The mystery of Margaret's presence had resolved itself not in revelation or drama, but in the slow, steady unfolding of observation, care, and deliberate presence. And in that calm, quiet understanding, the town, the orchards, the wetlands, the cliffs, and the groves all seemed to breathe softly with her memory, leaving a serene, unhurried rhythm that lingered long after they had walked away.